Before we begin, if you haven't watched part 1 of this true crime story, I'd recommend starting there, link in the description. So you could best immerse and understand the full context of what happened to Marcus Johnson and how a simple shoelace exposed Ethan Caldwell's elaborate deception. But if you've already seen it, or if you want to dive straight into this next chapter and go back later, let's continue with a story that proves sometimes the people who enable monsters are just as guilty as the monsters themselves. 6 months had passed since Ethan Caldwell stood in Judge McNally's courtroom and admitted, finally, to tampering with evidence and obstructing justice. 6 months since he'd been led away in handcuffs to begin serving what would likely be the rest of his productive adult life behind bars. The media had moved on to other stories, other scandals, other tragedies that captured the public's shrinking attention span. The protesters had dispersed. The think pieces about privilege and racism and justice had been written, shared, and forgotten. But for Marcus Johnson, those 6 months had been anything but quiet. It was a Tuesday morning in late June, almost exactly 1 year since the attack that had changed his life forever, and Marcus sat in the waiting room of Dr. Patricia Okonkwo's office at Temple University Hospital. Not the emergency room where she treated him that horrible night, but her private practice where she now saw him every 3 months to monitor the ongoing complications from his injuries. His mother sat beside him as she always did, her hand resting protectively on his arm. Diane Johnson had aged in the past year. New lines creased her face, and her hair, which had been mostly black with a few strands of gray, was now more gray than black. The stress of watching her son suffer, of navigating the legal system, of fighting for basic justice had taken its toll. Marcus Johnson? A nurse called from the doorway. They stood together and followed the nurse back to an examination room. The routine was familiar now: blood pressure, weight check, vision test. Marcus's left eye, the one that had been damaged when Connor O'Brien kicked him in the face, could barely distinguish light from dark. Dr. Okonkwo had warned him it would never improve, but they monitored it anyway, watching for signs of further deterioration. Dr. Okonkwo entered 20 minutes later, reviewing Marcus's chart on her tablet. She looked up and smiled, but it was the kind of smile healthcare providers gave when they were trying to project optimism they didn't quite feel. "How are you doing, Marcus? Any changes since we last met?" "The headaches are worse," Marcus admitted. "Especially when I try to read for more than 30 minutes. And I'm still having the nightmares." Dr. Okonkwo made notes. "Are you still seeing Dr. Chen for the psychological support?" "Twice a week." "Good. That's important." She conducted her examination, checking his vision, his range of motion, the healing of his ribs, the function of his arm. Everything was progressing as well as could be expected, which meant permanent limitations, chronic pain, and a future full of medical appointments and prescriptions. When the examination was finished, Dr. Okonkwo sat down, her expression serious. "Marcus, I need to talk to you about something. The bills from your ongoing treatment, the surgeries, the therapy, the medications, they're exceeding what the restitution order from Ethan's criminal case will cover. You're looking at potentially another $250,000 in medical expenses over the next 5 years, and that's a conservative estimate. Your vision might require additional surgeries. The headaches could indicate ongoing issues that need specialized treatment. And the psychological care is going to be long-term." Diane's hand tightened on Marcus's arm. "We're managing. Mrs. Johnson, with respect, I've seen your insurance statements. You're going to hit your lifetime maximum soon. And the restitution payments from the Caldwells are being tied up in bankruptcy proceedings because Richard Caldwell's business collapsed and he's claiming he can't pay." Marcus felt a familiar surge of anger. Even from prison, even after everything, Ethan and his family were still making his life harder. The $250,000 restitution Judge Holloway had ordered was supposed to help cover his medical expenses and compensate for the lost scholarship. But in the 6 months since sentencing, Marcus and his mother had received exactly $0. Richard Caldwell's attorneys kept filing motions, claiming financial hardship, asking for delays and modifications. "What are we supposed to do?" Marcus asked. Dr. Okonkwo hesitated. "Have you considered a civil lawsuit? The criminal restitution is separate from civil liability. You could sue not just Ethan and his family, but potentially Lincoln Prep for failing to protect you despite knowing about the harassment. In civil court, you could recover much more substantial damages, enough to actually cover your medical care and compensate you for what you've lost." Marcus and his mother exchanged glances. They'd discussed this possibility before, but the thought of more legal proceedings, more trials, more reliving the worst night of his life, had seemed unbearable. But Dr. Okonkwo was right. The medical bills were piling up. Diane had taken on a second job to help cover costs. They'd had to move to a smaller apartment. The financial burden of what Ethan had done was crushing them just as surely as the physical and psychological trauma. "We'll think about it," Diane said quietly. As they left the hospital and walked to their car, Marcus noticed something on the windshield. Not a parking ticket, a business card tucked under the wiper blade. He picked it up and read the name, Jennifer Campos, attorney at law, specializing in civil rights litigation and personal injury. He flipped the card over. Written in neat handwriting on the back, "Mr. Johnson, I've been following your case. I believe you have grounds for a substantial civil suit against multiple parties. Please call me. Initial consultation is free and I work on contingency. You don't pay unless we win. You deserve better than what the criminal system gave you." Marcus showed the card to his mother. "That's kind of creepy," Diane said. "How did she know we'd be here?" "Court records are public. She probably knows about my medical appointments." Marcus stared at the card. "Should I call her? Let's go home and think about it. Pray about it. If this is what we're supposed to do, we'll know." But Marcus already knew. Dr. Okonkwo was right, they were drowning financially. The criminal case had given them justice in the form of Ethan's imprisonment, but it hadn't given them the resources to actually deal with the consequences of his crime. And if Lincoln Prep had really failed to protect him despite knowing about years of harassment, shouldn't they be held accountable too? That evening, Marcus called Jennifer Campos. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and professional. "Marcus, thank you for calling. I know this must feel intrusive, me leaving my card on your car like that, but I wanted to reach out personally. I've been practicing civil rights law for 15 years and your case. What happened to you and more importantly, what didn't happen when you reported the harassment? It represents everything wrong with how institutions fail to protect vulnerable students. I'm not sure I want to go through more legal proceedings," Marcus said honestly. "The criminal trials were exhausting. I understand. But here's the thing, a civil case is different. In the criminal case, the focus was on punishing Ethan for what he did. In a civil case, the focus is on making you whole. It's about getting you the resources you need for the rest of your life. And more than that, it's about holding accountable the people and institutions that enabled Ethan's behavior for years. You think we can win against Lincoln Prep? They have a lot of money. A lot of expensive lawyers. So did the Caldwell family, and look how that turned out. Marcus, I don't take cases I don't believe I can win. And I believe, based on the public record from the criminal trial, that we have an exceptionally strong case. Not just against the school, but potentially against individual administrators who actively suppressed your complaints." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "What would a case like this involve?" "First, we'd file a civil complaint alleging negligence, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and civil rights violations. We'd be suing Lincoln Prep, the school district, and potentially individual administrators like Vice Principal Henderson who ignored your reports of harassment. We'd also sue the Caldwell family estate for damages beyond what the criminal restitution covers. Then we'd enter what's called discovery. That's where both sides exchange evidence, take depositions, gather documents. And I promise you, Marcus, the discovery process is going to uncover things that the criminal trial never touched. Emails between administrators. Financial records showing how the Caldwell's donations influenced school policy. Testimony from other students who were also harassed but were too afraid to come forward. Other students? I've done preliminary research. You weren't the only black student at Lincoln Prep who experienced harassment. You were just the one who got hurt badly enough that it couldn't be ignored anymore. There are other victims, Marcus. And a civil case gives them a chance to be heard too. The idea that he wasn't alone, that other students had suffered similar treatment, made Marcus feel both validated and angry. How many others had been tormented while administrators looked the other way? "If we do this," Marcus said slowly, "I want it to mean something. I don't just want money. I want the school to actually change. I want them to admit what they did wrong. That's exactly what we'll fight for. Real structural change. And accountability. Will you meet with me? Let me lay out the full case, show you what I've found, and then you can make an informed decision." Marcus looked at his mother, who was watching him with an expression of fierce protectiveness mixed with exhaustion. He thought about the medical bills stacked on their kitchen table. He thought about the scholarship he'd lost, the future that had been stolen from him. And he thought about other students maybe sitting in classrooms at Lincoln Prep right now, experiencing harassment and being told to keep quiet, to not make waves, to accept that this was just how things were. "Okay," he said. "Let's meet." 3 days later, Marcus and Diane sat in Jennifer Campos's office in Center City, Philadelphia. The office was modest but professional, Not the kind of ostentatious display of wealth that expensive corporate lawyers favored, but comfortable and efficient. Framed newspaper articles on the wall chronicled Campos's previous victories: a $12 million settlement against a police department for excessive force, a landmark discrimination case against a Fortune 500 company, a civil rights suit that had changed state law. Campos herself was in her mid-40s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a blazer and slacks, professional but not stuffy. On her desk sat a thick binder labeled Johnson vs. Lincoln Prep et al., Preliminary Research. "Thank you both for coming," she said, gesturing for them to sit. "I know this is difficult, so I'll be direct. Based on the evidence that's already public from the criminal trial, plus additional research my team has conducted, I believe you have grounds for a civil lawsuit that could result in a settlement or judgment in the range of $15 to $25 million. Diane gasped. Marcus felt his heart rate accelerate. "That's not a guarantee," Campos continued quickly. "Civil cases are unpredictable. But the facts are compelling. Let me walk you through what we'd be alleging." She opened the binder and pulled out a timeline that stretched across multiple pages. This is a documented timeline of every reported incident of harassment against Marcus during his 3 years at Lincoln Prep. The criminal trial established that Ethan Caldwell and his friends engaged in a pattern of racist bullying. But what the criminal trial didn't fully explore was the school's response, or lack thereof, to Marcus's repeated complaints. She pointed to entries on the timeline. September 2021, freshman year. Marcus reports to his guidance counselor that Ethan called him a racial slur. The counselor tells him to develop a thicker skin. No disciplinary action taken. November 2021. Marcus's mother calls Vice Principal Henderson to report that Marcus's locker was vandalized with racist graffiti. Henderson promises to investigate. No follow-up. February 2022. Marcus is pushed down the stairs by Dylan Marchetti. He reports it. Marchetti claims it was an accident. No investigation. April 2022. The incident in the cafeteria where Ethan accidentally knocked Marcus's lunch tray on him and used a racial slur. Multiple witnesses. Marcus and his friend Amber Richardson both report it. Henderson says it's he said, without video evidence. The timeline continued through sophomore year and into junior year, documenting over 40 separate incidents that Marcus had reported to school authorities. In every single case, the response had been inadequate or non-existent. "Now," Campos said, pulling out another set of documents, "here's where it gets interesting. Through preliminary discovery, we filed some strategic FOIA requests with the school district. I obtained records of donations from the Caldwell family to Lincoln Prep over the past 5 years. Want to guess how much they donated?" $2 million, Marcus said, remembering the testimony from the criminal trial. "For the new athletic center." That was just one donation. Total, over 5 years, the Caldwells gave Lincoln Prep over $7 million. They were the school's single largest donors. They had buildings named after them. Richard Caldwell was on the board of trustees. Patricia Caldwell chaired the fundraising committee. Campos pulled out another document. "I also obtained, through another FOIA request, emails between administrators. Look at this one, sent by Vice Principal Henderson to Principal Mary Catherine Brennan in March of this year, 2 months before the attack." She slid the printed email across the desk. Marcus read it, his hands beginning to shake. From Henderson James to Brennan Mary Catherine, subject: Marcus Johnson situation. "Marcus Johnson came to my office again today with more complaints about Ethan Caldwell and his friends. This is becoming a pattern. The Johnson kid seems to be hypersensitive to typical teenage social dynamics. Every joke, every accidental bump in the hallway he interprets as racism. I'm concerned that if we take any disciplinary action against Ethan, Richard Caldwell is going to be very unhappy. As you know, the Caldwells are in the middle of deciding whether to fund the new science wing. That's a $4 million pledge we can't afford to jeopardize. I recommend we continue monitoring the situation but avoid any official disciplinary measures unless there's incontrovertible evidence of misconduct. Perhaps we can have the guidance counselor work with Marcus on conflict resolution strategies? Let me know your thoughts. J.H. Marcus felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. The vice principal had explicitly recommended avoiding disciplinary action because it might upset the Caldwell's donation. His safety had been sacrificed for money. "There are more emails like this," Campos said quietly. "Over a dozen. Administrators discussing how to manage the Marcus Johnson situation without alienating the Caldwells. How to keep the harassment complaints from creating problems for the school's fundraising. These emails establish a clear pattern. The school knew you were being harassed, they knew it was escalating, and they made a deliberate choice to prioritize donor relations over your safety. Diane was crying silently, tears streaming down her face. They knew, she whispered. They knew my baby was in danger and they did nothing. Worse than nothing, Campos said. They actively covered it up. They discouraged Marcus from filing complaints. They told him he was being too sensitive. They gaslight him into thinking the problem was his perception rather than the reality of what was happening to him. Marcus felt a rage building in him that was almost as intense as what he'd felt that night in the warehouse. Ethan had beaten him with bats and fists. But the school, the administrators who were supposed to protect him, they'd handed Ethan the weapons and told him where to strike. What about other students? Marcus asked, his voice tight. You said there were others. Campos nodded. We've identified at least 8 other Black and Hispanic students who attended Lincoln Prep during the same period and who reported experiencing racial harassment. Most of them were also on scholarship programs. None of their complaints resulted in meaningful disciplinary action. And here's the crucial part. 2 of them reported harassment specifically from Ethan Caldwell and his friends. The school had multiple data points establishing that Ethan was engaging in a pattern of racist bullying, but because of who his family was, he faced no consequences. She pulled out another set of documents. I've made preliminary contact with 3 of these former students. They're willing to testify in a civil case. One of them, a young woman named Keisha Williams who graduated last year, kept a journal documenting everything that happened to her. She has dates, times, witnesses, and records of her complaints to administrators. It's devastating testimony. Marcus thought about Keisha Williams and the others, all of them suffering in silence, all of them being told their experiences weren't real or weren't important enough to warrant action. The scope of the institutional failure was staggering. So what would the case actually look like? Diane asked. How long would it take? We'd file a civil complaint in federal court, Campos explained. Federal because we'd be alleging civil rights violations under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination in federally funded educational programs. Lincoln Prep receives some federal funding, so they're subject to Title VI. We'd name Lincoln Prep, the school district, Vice Principal Henderson, Principal Brennan, and possibly other administrators as defendants. We'd also name the Caldwell family estate for the assault and battery claim, though that's somewhat separate. The case would proceed through several phases. First, the defendants would file motions to dismiss, arguing that we don't have a valid claim. We'd fight those motions and win. I'm confident about that given the evidence. Then we'd enter discovery where both sides gather evidence. That's where we'd depose administrators, obtain more emails and documents and build our case. Discovery typically takes 6 to 12 months. After discovery, there's usually a settlement conference where we'd attempt to negotiate a resolution without going to trial. Many cases settle at this stage. If we can't reach an acceptable settlement, we'd go to trial. How long total? Marcus asked. Realistically? 18 months to 2 years from filing to resolution, whether by settlement or verdict. I know that seems like a long time, especially after everything you've been through. But civil cases move more slowly than criminal cases. The trade-off is that we have more control over the process, and the potential recovery is much greater. Marcus looked at his mother. She looked back at him, her eyes red from crying but her jaw set with determination. I want to do it, Marcus said. Not just for the money, though we need that, but because someone needs to hold the school accountable. Someone needs to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Campos smiled. That's exactly the right reason to do this. Now, I need to explain how I work. I take cases like this on contingency, which means you don't pay me anything up front. If we win or settle, I take a percentage of the recovery, typically 1/3, though it can be higher if the case goes to trial. If we lose, you pay nothing. I cover all the costs of litigation, filing fees, expert witnesses, depositions, everything. Does that work for you? Yes, Diane said immediately. We can't afford to pay a lawyer by the hour. This is our only option. Then let's do it. Campos pulled out a retainer agreement. I'll need you both to sign this and then we'll get started. I should tell you, once we file this complaint, things are going to get intense. The defendants are going to fight hard. They're going to try to drag your name through the mud, make you look like you're just after money, argue that the harassment wasn't as bad as you claim. The school is going to mobilize its wealthy alumni and donors to pressure you to drop the case. It's not going to be pleasant. Nothing about the last year has been pleasant, Marcus said. "I can handle it." "I believe you can." Campos slid the retainer agreement across the desk. "Let's get justice." Marcus and Diane signed the documents, and Jennifer Campos officially became their attorney. As they left her office, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Not the naive hope of his freshman year, when he believed that hard work and good behavior would be enough to overcome prejudice. But a harder, more realistic hope. The hope that comes from having someone in your corner who knows how to fight, who's fought before, and one who sees you not as a victim but as someone deserving of justice. 1 week later, on July 3rd, just before the Independence Day holiday, Jennifer Campos filed a civil complaint in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. The case was officially titled Johnson v. Lincoln Preparatory Academy et al., and the list of defendants was extensive. Lincoln Preparatory Academy, the Philadelphia School District, as Lincoln Prep's chartering authority; James Henderson, individually and in his capacity as Vice Principal; Mary Catherine Brennan, individually and in her capacity as Principal; the estate of Richard Caldwell. Richard had died of a heart attack 3 months after Ethan's sentencing. The stress, his doctors said, had killed him. Patricia Caldwell, individually; Ethan James Caldwell, individually. The complaint was 87 pages long and alleged violation of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, racial discrimination in education; violation of Title IX, hostile educational environment; negligence, failure to protect despite knowledge of danger; intentional infliction of emotional distress; assault and battery against the Caldwells; conspiracy to deprive civil rights. The complaint sought compensatory damages, punitive damages, and injunctive relief, requiring Lincoln Prep to implement comprehensive reforms to prevent future harassment. The media coverage was immediate and intense. Local news ran stories with headlines like "Hate Crime Victim Sues School for Millions" and "Lincoln Prep Faces Reckoning Over Handling of Racist Bullying." National outlets picked up the story because of its connection to the high-profile criminal case. Legal analysts debated whether Marcus had a strong case. Education policy experts discussed the broader implications for how schools handle harassment complaints. And at Lincoln Prep, where summer session was in progress, the response was swift and defensive. 2 days after the complaint was filed, Principal Brennan issued a statement. Lincoln Preparatory Academy is deeply saddened by the events that occurred last year involving former students Ethan Caldwell and Marcus Johnson. We have always maintained a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination and harassment. Any suggestion that our administration failed to respond appropriately to complaints is categorically false and contradicted by our documented policies and procedures. We intend to vigorously defend against these baseless allegations. We are confident that the facts will demonstrate that Lincoln Prep acted appropriately at all times and that Mr. Johnson's unfortunate experience was the result of criminal conduct by fellow students, not any failure by our institution. Jennifer Campos read the statement and smiled. She'd expected exactly this response: complete denial, attacking the victim, asserting confidence. It was the standard playbook for institutions facing accountability. But she'd seen the emails. She knew what the discovery process would reveal. And she knew that Principal Brennan's confidence statement would look very different once the documentary evidence came to light. The first major development came 3 weeks after filing, when the defendants filed their motions to dismiss. It was standard procedure. Defendants always tried to get cases dismissed before discovery could begin, arguing that even if everything the plaintiff alleged was true, it wouldn't constitute a valid legal claim. Lincoln Prep's motion argued the school had no duty to protect Marcus from other students' criminal conduct. The school's response to harassment complaints was within the bounds of reasonable discretion. Title VI doesn't create individual liability for administrators, so Henderson and Brennan should be dismissed. The claims were barred by various immunity doctrines. The Caldwell estate's motion argued that Marcus was seeking to relitigate issues already resolved in the criminal case, and that the civil claims were duplicative. Campos spent 2 weeks preparing her opposition brief, and the hearing on the motions to dismiss was scheduled for early September. Meanwhile, something else was happening, something that Jennifer Campos had hoped for but hadn't dared to count on. Other victims were coming forward. It started with a phone call to Campos's office from a young man named Isaiah Martinez, who'd graduated from Lincoln Prep 3 years earlier. "I saw the news about Marcus's lawsuit," Isaiah said, "and I had to call because the same thing happened to me. Not as bad, I wasn't assaulted, but the harassment, the slurs, the school ignoring my complaints, all of it. I thought I was the only one. I thought it was just my experience. But if Marcus is trying to hold them accountable, I want to help." Campos listened to Isaiah's story. He'd been a scholarship student from North Philadelphia, recruited for his academic abilities. From his first day at Lincoln Prep, he'd faced casual racism, comments about affirmative action, jokes about his accent, questions about whether his family was legal. He'd reported incidents to Vice Principal Henderson and had been told he was being too sensitive. The harassment had escalated to the point where Isaiah dreaded going to school. He'd finished his junior year and then transferred to a public school for senior year, preferring to give up Lincoln Prep's prestige rather than endure more abuse. "Did Ethan Caldwell or his friends ever harass you specifically?" Campos asked. "Yeah, especially Ethan. He used to call me border hopper in the hallways. Said my parents probably cleaned toilets. Asked if I was here to mow the lawn." Isaiah's voice cracked. "I reported it to Henderson. He said boys will be boys, that I needed to learn to take a joke. Would you be willing to testify about this in Marcus's case?" "Yes. I want these people held accountable. I thought about speaking up during the criminal trial, but I was scared. Now I'm ready." After Isaiah came Keisha Williams, the young woman Campos had already identified. Keisha's journal was a goldmine of evidence, 3 years' worth of documented harassment, with specific dates, details, and names. She'd experienced everything Marcus had experienced: racial slurs, vandalism, social ostracization. And like Marcus, she'd reported it repeatedly, only to be dismissed. "I kept the journal because I thought someday I might need proof," Keisha explained when she met with Campos. "I didn't know what I'd use it for, but I knew the school was lying when they said they took discrimination seriously. I wanted a record of the truth." Then came David Chin, who'd been called Kung Flu during the pandemic and had been accused of bringing the virus to Lincoln Prep. He'd reported the harassment to guidance counselors and had been told to educate his peers about Asian American culture rather than being protected from racist attacks. Then came Sofia Rodriguez, whose locker had been vandalized with swastikas because some students thought she was Jewish. She wasn't, but the anti-Semitism was just as appalling regardless. Then came 3 more students, each with their own story of harassment and institutional betrayal. By mid-August, Jennifer Campos had 8 additional victims willing to testify. And the pattern was undeniable. Lincoln Prep had systematically failed to protect minority students from harassment, had repeatedly dismissed complaints, and had prioritized donor relations and institutional reputation over student safety. She filed an amended complaint adding these testimonies as supporting evidence and requested class action status, arguing that this wasn't just Marcus's individual case but a systemic failure affecting multiple students. The hearing on the motions to dismiss took place on September 12 in the federal courthouse in downtown Philadelphia. The courtroom was smaller than the state criminal court where Ethan's trial had taken place, but it was packed nonetheless. Marcus sat with his mother at the plaintiff's table, Jennifer Campos beside them. At the defense table sat a team of 5 attorneys representing Lincoln Prep, plus separate counsel for Henderson, Brennan, and the Caldwell estate. The judge was Miriam Foster, a black woman in her late 50s who'd been on the federal bench for 20 years. She had a reputation for being brilliant, no-nonsense, and deeply skeptical of arguments that institutions bore no responsibility for foreseeable harms. The defendant's attorneys argued their motions first. Lincoln Prep's lead counsel, a silver-haired man named Edmund Pierce from a prestigious Center City firm, made the school's case with polished confidence. "Your Honor, while we sympathize with Mr. Johnson's terrible experience, his lawsuit conflates criminal conduct by fellow students with alleged failures by our client. Lincoln Prep is an educational institution, not a police force. We cannot be held liable for the unforeseeable criminal acts of students, particularly when those acts occurred off school property and outside school hours." Judge Foster looked up from the briefs. "Counselor, the plaintiff's complaint alleges that Lincoln Prep had knowledge of an escalating pattern of harassment over 3 years and failed to take meaningful action. That doesn't sound unforeseeable to me. That sounds like the opposite of unforeseeable." Pierce shifted his approach. "The school responded to each complaint appropriately given the information available at the time. Without clear evidence, video footage, multiple witnesses, physical proof, it's difficult to discipline students based solely on conflicting accounts. The school acted reasonably within the constraints of." "The plaintiff has submitted emails," Judge Foster interrupted, "from your client's administrators explicitly stating that they were avoiding disciplinary action to avoid upsetting donors. Are you arguing that constitutes reasonable judgment?" Pierce looked uncomfortable. "Those emails have been taken out of context, Your Honor. The full context shows administrators engaged in thoughtful deliberation about how to balance multiple concerns, including fundraising concerns over student safety. That's an uncharitable characterization. It's what the email says. Judge Foster turned to Campos. Miss Campos, your response? Jennifer Campos stood. Your Honor, this case is exactly why Title VI exists. When a school receives federal funding, it accepts an obligation to provide an education free from racial discrimination and harassment. The defendants argue they had no duty to protect Marcus Johnson, but Title VI creates precisely such a duty. The defendants argue their response was reasonable, but deliberately choosing not to investigate or discipline harassment because of donor concerns isn't reasonable. It's a violation of federal civil rights law. The defendants argue you're trying to relitigate the criminal case. We're not, Your Honor. The criminal case established that Ethan Caldwell and his co-defendants committed assault and hate crimes. Our case establishes that Lincoln Prep enabled those crimes by refusing to take action despite years of warnings. These are distinct claims with distinct defendants. Judge Foster reviewed her notes. I'm going to hear argument on the individual liability issue. Counsel for Henderson and Brennan, your position is that Title VI doesn't allow suits against individuals. The attorney representing the administrators, a sharp woman named Rachel Morrison, stood. That's correct, Your Honor. Title VI creates liability for institutions, not individual employees. The proper defendant is Lincoln Prep, not my clients personally. But the plaintiff also alleges state law claims, negligence and intentional infliction of emotional distress, which do allow individual liability. Those claims fail because my clients were acting within the scope of their employment and are protected by qualified immunity. Qualified immunity for deliberately ignoring harassment complaints? For exercising professional judgment in a complex educational environment. Judge Foster looked skeptical but reserved judgment. The hearing continued for another hour, with arguments about each aspect of the motions to dismiss. Finally, Judge Foster announced she would rule from the bench. I've reviewed the complaint, the motions, and the supporting materials carefully. Here's my ruling. The motions to dismiss are denied in substantial part. The plaintiff has stated valid claims under Title VI for which relief can be granted. The allegations, if proven true, would establish that Lincoln Prep had knowledge of an escalating pattern of racial harassment and deliberately failed to respond adequately. Whether the school's response was actually inadequate is a question of fact for trial, not a question of law for dismissal. Marcus felt his heart leap. They were going to trial. On the individual liability claims, Judge Foster continued, I'm dismissing the Title VI claims against Henderson and Brennan personally, as those claims must be brought against the institution. However, the state law claims for negligence and intentional infliction of emotional distress survive. The qualified immunity defense may apply, but that's also a fact question that can't be resolved at the motion to dismiss stage. She looked at both tables. This case will proceed to discovery. I'm setting a discovery deadline of 6 months from today, with a settlement conference to follow. I encourage the parties to seriously consider settlement given the evidence I've seen, but if this case needs to go to trial, we'll set a trial date after the settlement conference. Any questions? Both sides had procedural questions about scheduling and logistics, which Judge Foster addressed efficiently. Then she adjourned the hearing. As Marcus and his mother left the courthouse with Jennifer Campos, they were mobbed by reporters shouting questions. Campos raised her hand for quiet. Today, Judge Foster ruled that Marcus Johnson's case will proceed. The school and its administrators will have to answer for their failure to protect him and other students from racist harassment. We look forward to the discovery process, which will bring to light the full extent of Lincoln Prep's institutional failures. Thank you. She ushered Marcus and Diane through the crowd and into a waiting car. That went better than I hoped, Campos said once they were safely away from the courthouse. Judge Foster clearly saw through the defense's arguments. She's not going to let them hide behind legal technicalities when the evidence is this damning. What happens now? Marcus asked. Now the real work begins. Discovery. That's where we gather evidence, take depositions, force the school to turn over documents they'd rather keep hidden. And trust me, Marcus, what we've seen so far is just the tip of the iceberg. Once we start digging into Lincoln Prep's records, I expect we're going to find evidence that makes those emails look tame by comparison. She was right. Discovery in civil cases is a formal process governed by strict rules. Each side can request documents from the other side, can ask written questions called interrogatories, and can compel witnesses to give sworn testimony in depositions. Unlike criminal cases, where prosecutors have to share evidence with defendants, civil discovery is reciprocal. Both sides have to turn over relevant materials. Jennifer Campos filed her first set of document requests 2 days after the hearing. She demanded all emails between Lincoln Prep administrators mentioning Marcus Johnson or racial harassment complaints from 2021 to present, all emails between administrators and the Caldwell family from 2018 to present, all records of donations from the Caldwell family, all policies and procedures regarding harassment complaints, all training materials provided to staff about handling discrimination, all documents related to other harassment complaints during the relevant time period, all financial records showing how donor contributions influence school decisions. She also served interrogatories, formal written questions that had to be answered under oath, asking administrators to detail their knowledge of Marcus's complaints, their reasons for not taking action, and their communications with the Caldwell family. And she noticed depositions, formal interviews under oath, of Principal Brennan, Vice Principal Henderson, guidance counselors, teachers, and the Caldwell family's attorney who'd visited Connor O'Brien in jail. Lincoln Prep's attorneys fought back, filing motions to quash the subpoenas, arguing the requests were overbroad and burdensome, claiming various privileges. But Judge Foster was unsympathetic to most of their objections. "You're accused of systematically ignoring harassment complaints," she said during one hearing on discovery disputes. "The plaintiff is entitled to documents that would prove or disprove that accusation. If producing those documents is burdensome, perhaps you should have kept better records." Motion denied. "You have 30 days to produce the requested materials." The first wave of documents arrived at Campos's office in mid-October. Over 50,000 pages of emails, memos, policies, and financial records. Campos hired 2 paralegals specifically to help review the material, and they set up a war room in her office with white boards covering the walls, timelines being constructed, connections being mapped. What they found was even worse than they'd imagined. The emails revealed a disturbing pattern. Over the 5 years of the Caldwell family's major donations, administrators had received at least 30 formal complaints about racist harassment at Lincoln Prep, not just against Marcus but against multiple students. In almost every case, the response had been inadequate or non-existent. And in several cases, the emails explicitly mentioned concerns about upsetting donors. One particularly damning email from Principal Brennan to the Board of Trustees, dated January 2023, read, "We need to be mindful of how we handle complaints from scholarship students. Several of our major donors have expressed concern that the school is becoming too diverse, and that we're losing our traditional character. I'm not saying we should ignore legitimate harassment, but we also can't create an environment where every interpersonal conflict is treated as a civil rights violation. Our wealthy families pay full tuition and make substantial donations. We need to be responsive to their concerns as well." Campos read that email 3 times, barely able to believe a school principal had put such a sentiment in writing. It was a smoking gun, explicit acknowledgement that the school was prioritizing wealthy donors over the safety of minority students. But there was more. Financial records showed that in the 2 years before Marcus's attack, the Caldwell family had not just donated to the school, they'd also provided personal loans to 2 board members who were facing financial difficulties. Richard Caldwell had essentially bought influence over the school's governance. And there were text messages between Richard Caldwell and Principal Brennan showing that Richard had directly intervened multiple times when Ethan faced potential discipline. March 2022, after the cafeteria incident. "Richard, Mary Catherine, I heard there was an incident today with Ethan and that scholarship boy. I trust we can handle this internally without any official disciplinary action." Brennan, "Of course, Richard. Boys will be boys. I'll have Henderson talk to both of them." Richard, "Appreciated. The Science Wing fundraising is going well, by the way. Should hit our target by summer." Brennan, "Wonderful news." The implication was clear. Donations were being used as leverage to protect Ethan from consequences. Jennifer Campos couldn't wait to depose Principal Brennan and confront her with these messages. The depositions began in November. A deposition is a formal proceeding where attorneys question witnesses under oath. Everything is recorded by a court reporter, and the testimony can be used at trial. Unlike trial testimony, depositions happen in conference rooms rather than courtrooms and judges aren't present. But lying in a deposition is still perjury. The first deposition was Vice Principal James Henderson. Henderson arrived at Campos's office accompanied by his attorney, looking nervous and defensive. He was in his late 40s, with thinning hair and the soft physique of someone who spent his days behind a desk. He wore a suit that looked like it had been purchased specifically for the deposition, still stiff and formal. After the court reporter swore him in, Campos began her questioning. "Mr. Henderson, How long have you been vice principal at Lincoln Prep? 8 years. And part of your responsibilities include handling student discipline and complaints about harassment, correct? Among other duties, yes. Are you familiar with Lincoln Prep's anti-harassment policy? Yes. Does that policy require you to investigate all complaints of harassment? Henderson shifted in his seat. It requires us to investigate credible complaints. Who determines credibility? It's a judgment call based on the circumstances. During the 2021 to 2022 and 2022 to 2023 school years, did you receive complaints from Marcus Johnson about racial harassment? Henderson's attorney leaned forward. You can answer. Yes, Marcus made several complaints. Several? How many would you estimate? I don't recall the exact number. Campos pulled out a document. I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 14, which is a log from the guidance counselor's office documenting complaints. According to this log, Marcus Johnson filed formal complaints on 19 separate occasions. Does that refresh your recollection? Henderson glanced at the document. If that's what the log says. 19 separate complaints over 2 years. How many of those complaints resulted in disciplinary action against the students Marcus identified as harassing him? I'd have to review our records to say definitively. Let me help you. The answer is 0. Not a single complaint resulted in disciplinary action. Is that correct? Our investigations didn't find sufficient evidence to warrant discipline in most cases. Did you interview witnesses for these investigations? Sometimes. Did you review video footage? When it was available. Did you consult with law enforcement? That wasn't necessary. These were school matters. Campos pulled out another document, the email Henderson had sent to Principal Brennan about not wanting to upset Richard Caldwell. I'm showing you Exhibit 31. This is an email you sent to Principal Brennan in March 2023. Can you read the highlighted portion for the record? Henderson read it silently, his face going red. I'm concerned that if we take any disciplinary action against Ethan, Richard Caldwell is going to be very unhappy. As you know, the Caldwells are in the middle of deciding whether to fund the new science wing. That's a $4 million pledge we can't afford to jeopardize. You wrote that, correct? Yes, but it's out of context. What context would make that acceptable, Mr. Henderson? You're explicitly saying you're avoiding discipline because of fundraising concerns. I was outlining multiple factors for the principal's consideration. Part of my job is thinking about the school's overall interests. Is student safety part of the school's overall interests? Of course. But in this email, the only interest you mention is maintaining donor relations. Correct. I mentioned other concerns in other communications. Show me one. Show me one email where you expressed concern about Marcus Johnson's safety that wasn't overshadowed by concerns about upsetting donors. Henderson looked at his attorney, who was frantically taking notes. I can't recall a specific email off the top of my head. That's because there aren't any, are there, Mr. Henderson? You were so focused on keeping the Caldwells happy that you forgot your fundamental responsibility was to protect students. That's not fair. Did Marcus Johnson get beaten nearly to death? Yes, but did he report harassment from his attacker 19 times before that happened? The harassment complaints and the assault weren't necessarily connected. They weren't connected? Ethan Caldwell used racial slurs during the assault, the same slurs Marcus reported him using in school. How is that not connected? Henderson had no answer. The deposition continued for 6 more hours, with Campos systematically destroying Henderson's credibility. By the end, he'd admitted that he'd never seriously investigated most of Marcus's complaints, that he'd been aware of the Caldwell family's donations, and that he'd prioritized institutional concerns over student safety. Principal Mary Catherine Brennan's deposition was even more devastating. Brennan was in her early 60s, with carefully styled gray hair and the polished demeanor of someone who'd spent decades navigating elite educational environments. She'd been principal of Lincoln Prep for 12 years and had overseen the school's expansion from 400 students to nearly 800. She arrived at the deposition with 2 attorneys, one representing her personally, one representing the school. That she felt she needed separate legal representation suggested she understood the jeopardy she faced. Campos started gently, establishing Brennan's background and responsibilities. Then she moved to the heart of the matter. Principal Brennan, would you say that ensuring student safety is your top priority? Absolutely. Nothing is more important than our students' well-being. And yet you received 19 formal complaints from Marcus Johnson about harassment and bullying, and you took no meaningful action. How do you reconcile that with your claim that student safety is your top priority? We took every complaint seriously. We investigated each one. What did those investigations consist of? We interviewed the students involved, gathered information, and made determinations based on the evidence. Did you ever interview witnesses beyond the students directly involved? Sometimes if it seemed necessary. Did it seem necessary in Marcus Johnson's case? Mr. Henderson handled most of those complaints. I trusted his judgment. Even though the complaints kept coming? 19 times over 2 years, and it never occurred to you that maybe Henderson wasn't handling them appropriately? Hindsight is 20/20, Ms. Campos. Campos pulled out the text messages between Brennan and Richard Caldwell. I'm showing you Exhibit 47. These are text messages between you and Richard Caldwell. In this exchange from March 2022, after Marcus reported that Ethan knocked his lunch tray on him and used a racial slur, Mr. Caldwell texts you asking you to handle it internally without any official disciplinary action. And you respond, "Of course, Richard. Boys will be boys." Do you remember this exchange? Brennan's composure slipped. I don't recall that specific text. Well, here it is. You agreed to avoid disciplinary action at the request of a student's parent. Is that appropriate? I may have been referring to handling it through counseling rather than formal discipline. But you didn't handle it through counseling either, did you? You did nothing. And in the same text chain, Mr. Caldwell mentions the Science Wing fundraising, and you respond enthusiastically. Were you trading student safety for donations, Principal Brennan? Absolutely not. That's a grotesque characterization. Then explain the text. Explain why, immediately after agreeing not to discipline Ethan, you're discussing fundraising. Those were separate topics. Were they? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like Richard Caldwell was using donations to buy protection for his son. And you were accepting that arrangement. Brennan's attorney interrupted. That's argumentative and calls for speculation. My client can't testify about what Mr. Caldwell's intentions were. Fine. Let me ask it differently. Principal Brennan, did you ever consider that accepting millions of dollars in donations from the Caldwell family might create a conflict of interest when handling complaints about Ethan Caldwell? We have policies about conflicts of interest. Did you follow them? I believe so. Did you ever recuse yourself from decisions involving Ethan because of the Caldwell family's donations? No, I didn't think it was necessary. Even though they were your largest donors? Being a large donor doesn't mean their son gets special treatment. But he did get special treatment, didn't he? 19 complaints, 0 discipline. That's not standard operating procedure, is it? Brennan had no good answer. The depositions continued through December. Guidance counselors testified about being pressured not to document complaints too formally. Teachers testified about witnessing harassment in hallways and being told by administrators not to make it a big deal. The school's diversity coordinator, hired just 2 years before the attack as a public relations response to criticism, testified that her recommendations for stronger anti-harassment policies had been repeatedly ignored by Brennan and the board. And perhaps most damning of all, one former board member testified that Richard Caldwell had explicitly told the board that if they disciplined Ethan, he would withdraw all financial support and encourage other wealthy families to do the same. He basically threatened the school, the former board member, a man named Thomas Chen who'd resigned in protest, testified. He said, "My son has a bright future, and I'm not going to let some diversity initiative ruin it." Those were his words. And the rest of the board was too afraid of losing his money to stand up to him. Jennifer Campos had been practicing civil rights law for 15 years, and she'd never had a case with evidence this strong. Every deposition revealed new information that supported Marcus's claims. Every document production contained emails that demonstrated the school's deliberate indifference to his safety. By January, even Lincoln Prep's attorneys knew they were in serious trouble. The settlement conference was scheduled for late January, presided over by a magistrate judge whose job was to help the parties reach a resolution without going to trial. Settlement conferences in civil cases are confidential. What's said in the conference can't be used at trial, which encourages parties to be more candid about the strengths and weaknesses of their cases. The conference took place in a large conference room at the federal courthouse. On one side of the table sat Marcus, Diane, and Jennifer Campos. On the other side sat a delegation from Lincoln Prep, 2 board members, an attorney, and a representative from the school's insurance company. Principal Brennan and Vice Principal Henderson were notably absent, having been told by their attorneys that their presence might inflame tensions. The magistrate judge, a grandfatherly man named Walter Hughes, began by explaining the process. "We're here to see if we can resolve this case without the time, expense, and uncertainty of trial. I'm going to speak with each side separately, carry offers back and forth, and try to find common ground. Everything said here is confidential and can't be used in court if we don't reach a settlement. My goal is to get you to a number and terms that both sides can live with. Let's start with the plaintiffs. Ms. Campos, what are you looking for? Campos had prepared for this moment carefully. In settlement negotiations, you typically started high, knowing you'd negotiate down. Your Honor, we're seeking $25 million in compensatory and punitive damages, plus injunctive relief requiring comprehensive reforms at Lincoln Prep. The reforms would include mandatory training for all staff, an independent ombudsman to handle harassment complaints, regular audits of the school's compliance with anti-discrimination policies, and a scholarship fund for minority students. One of the board members actually laughed. That's absurd. We'd never agree to anything close to that. Judge Hughes held up his hand. Let's keep this civil. Mr. Board Member, I'll talk to you in private shortly. For now, I want to understand the plaintiff's position. Ms. Campos, break down that $25 million for me. $5 million for past and future medical expenses. Marcus will need ongoing treatment for the rest of his life. $10 million for lost earning capacity. Marcus had a full scholarship to Temple University, was on track to become an engineer, and that future was stolen from him. $5 million for pain and suffering, the physical pain, the psychological trauma, the loss of his sense of safety in the world. And $5 million in punitive damages to punish the school's conduct and deter future misconduct. And the reforms you're seeking? We want to ensure this never happens to another student. The evidence shows Lincoln Prep has a systemic problem with how it handles harassment. We want court-ordered reforms with teeth, not just policy changes that can be ignored, but actual structural changes with monitoring and enforcement. Judge Hughes made notes. All right, let me talk to the defense. He left the room with the Lincoln Prep delegation, and Marcus, Diane, and Campos waited. $25 million, Marcus said quietly. That's more money than I can even imagine. It's what you deserve, Campos said. And honestly, it's less than what a jury might award if they hear all this evidence. Schools have been hit with verdicts in excess of $50 million for cases like this. Do you think they'll settle? They'd be foolish not to. If this goes to trial, they're going to be eviscerated. The emails, the depositions, the testimony from other students, it's devastating. Their insurance company knows it. The question is whether the board is realistic about their exposure. 30 minutes later, Judge Hughes returned alone. I've had a frank conversation with the defendants, he said. They're willing to settle, but obviously there's a significant gap between your demand and what they're prepared to offer. Their initial position is $2 million and some policy changes. Campos shook her head immediately. That's insulting. $2 million doesn't even cover Marcus's medical expenses, let alone compensate him for everything he's lost. I told them as much. But let's not dismiss it out of hand. It's an opening offer. The question is whether there's a realistic range where we can find agreement. What's your bottom line, Ms. Campos? What's the least you'd accept to settle this case? Campos looked at Marcus and Diane. They discussed this privately. The truth was any substantial settlement would change their lives. The medical bills were crushing them. Marcus's future was uncertain. They needed financial security. But this wasn't just about money. It was about accountability. It was about making sure the school admitted what it had done wrong and made real changes. $15 million in meaningful reforms, Campos said. That's our bottom line. $15 million gives Marcus the resources he needs for a lifetime of medical care and provides real compensation for what was taken from him. And the reforms need to include everything I outlined: training, ombudsman, audits, scholarship fund. We're not interested in cosmetic changes. We want real accountability. Judge Hughes nodded. Let me go back to them. The settlement conference lasted 8 hours, with Judge Hughes shuttling back and forth between the rooms, carrying offers and counteroffers. The negotiations were exhausting. Every $100,000 was fought over, every detail of the reforms was debated. By 6 p.m. they were close. Lincoln Prep was willing to pay $12 million, $8 million from their insurance policy, $4 million from the school's endowment. They were willing to implement most of the reforms Campos had requested, though they wanted some modifications to make them less onerous to administer. But there was one sticking point. The school refused to make any public admission of wrongdoing. They wanted the settlement agreement to include a clause stating that the school denied all liability and was settling purely to avoid the cost of litigation. That's a deal breaker, Marcus said when Judge Hughes presented the offer. They want to pay me off and then tell the world they did nothing wrong? No. I want them to admit they failed to protect me. I want them to acknowledge that their priorities were screwed up and that's why I almost died. Campos agreed. Your Honor, we need some form of public acknowledgement. It doesn't have to be a full admission of liability, but it needs to be something substantive. Otherwise, this settlement doesn't accomplish its purpose. Judge Hughes went back to the defense. He returned 20 minutes later. Here's what they're willing to do. The settlement agreement itself won't contain an admission of liability, that's standard in these cases, and their insurance company won't budge on it. But separately, as part of the settlement, Lincoln Prep will issue a public statement acknowledging that they failed Marcus Johnson, that their response to his complaints was inadequate, and that they're implementing comprehensive reforms to ensure it never happens again. The statement will be approved by you before it's released, and it will be publicized alongside the announcement of the settlement. Campos looked at Marcus. That's probably as good as we're going to get. In settlement negotiations, you rarely get everything you want. The question is whether this is enough. Marcus thought about it. $12 million would secure his future medically and financially. The reforms would protect other students. And a public statement acknowledging the school's failures would be something, not a full legal admission but a moral acknowledgement. What about Henderson and Brennan? Marcus asked. Do they keep their jobs? Judge Hughes consulted his notes. The board has agreed that as part of the settlement, both Henderson and Brennan will be placed on administrative leave pending an independent investigation into their conduct. If the investigation finds they violated school policies or breached their duties, they'll be terminated. That investigation will be conducted by an outside firm, not the school itself. That was something. Not the immediate termination Marcus would have preferred, but at least there would be accountability. All right, Marcus said. If my mom agrees, I'm willing to settle on those terms. Diane had been quiet throughout the negotiations, letting Marcus take the lead since this was his case, his life. But now she spoke up. I need to know that the reforms are real. That they're not just going to write some new policies and ignore them like they ignored the old ones. The reforms will be part of a consent decree approved by the federal court, Campos explained. That means they're enforceable. If Lincoln Prep violates the decree, we can go back to court and ask a judge to hold them in contempt. There's actual teeth to it. Diane looked at her son. They'd been through so much together over the past 18 months. The attack, the criminal trials, the medical procedures, the financial stress, and now months of this civil litigation. She wanted it to be over. She wanted Marcus to have security and peace. If you think this is right, baby, then I'm with you. Marcus turned to Judge Hughes. We'll accept the settlement. The magistrate judge smiled, the first time he'd smiled all day. Excellent. Let me finalize the terms with the defense and we'll get everything in writing. It took another 2 hours to hammer out the final details and draft the settlement agreement. By 8:30 p.m., everyone was signing documents. The settlement provided $12 million to be paid to Marcus Johnson, with $8 million paid immediately and $4 million paid in annual installments over 4 years. A public statement from Lincoln Prep acknowledging failures in handling harassment complaints, implementation of comprehensive reforms including mandatory training, an independent ombudsman, regular audits, and a $2 million scholarship fund for underrepresented students, administrative leave for Henderson and Brennan pending investigation. A consent decree making the reforms enforceable by federal court, both sides agreeing to dismiss all claims with prejudice, meaning they couldn't be refiled. As Marcus signed his name to the settlement agreement, he felt a complicated mix of emotions. Relief that the litigation was over. Satisfaction that he'd won accountability and reforms. But also a lingering sadness that no amount of money or policy changes could give him back what he'd lost. His health, his scholarship, his innocence. You did good, Campos told him as they left the courthouse. You fought for yourself and for every other student who might be in your position someday. That takes courage. The settlement was announced 3 days later at a joint press conference. Jennifer Campos stood at a podium outside the federal courthouse, with Marcus and Diane beside her. Today, we're pleased to announce that Marcus Johnson's civil rights lawsuit against Lincoln Preparatory Academy has been resolved, Campos began. The terms of the settlement are confidential in some respects, but I can tell you that Marcus has received substantial compensation that will provide for his medical needs and his future. More importantly, Lincoln Prep has agreed to implement comprehensive reforms to prevent what happened to Marcus from happening to anyone else. She stepped aside, and a representative from Lincoln Prep, not Principal Brennan but a board member named Elizabeth Hartman, stepped to the microphone. On behalf of Lincoln Preparatory Academy, I want to read a statement that has been approved by our Board of Trustees. She unfolded a piece of paper and read, "Lincoln Prep acknowledges that we failed Marcus Johnson. When he came to us with complaints about harassment and bullying, we did not respond with the urgency and seriousness that the situation demanded. We prioritized other concerns over his safety, and that was wrong. Marcus Johnson deserved better from us. He deserved to be protected, believed, and supported. Instead, he experienced escalating harassment that ultimately resulted in a violent assault that has left him with permanent injuries. We cannot undo what happened. We cannot give Marcus back his health or the future that was taken from him. But we can commit to doing better. We are implementing comprehensive reforms to ensure that every student at Lincoln Prep, regardless of their background, feels safe and valued. We are creating new structures for reporting and investigating harassment complaints, independent of our administration. We are requiring regular training for all staff. We are establishing a scholarship fund to support students from underrepresented communities. And we are inviting outside auditors to regularly review our compliance with anti-discrimination laws. These reforms are not voluntary. They are being overseen by the federal court, and we will be held accountable for implementing them. We hope that these changes will be Marcus Johnson's legacy at Lincoln Prep, that his suffering will result in a safer, more inclusive environment for future students. To Marcus and his family, we are deeply sorry. We failed you when you needed us most. We hope that the settlement and reforms represent a step toward making things right." Hartman folded the paper and stepped back from the microphone. There were no questions allowed. That was part of the settlement agreement, but the statement itself was powerful. It wasn't a full legal admission of liability, but it was a clear acknowledgement of moral failure. Marcus didn't speak at the press conference. He'd said everything he needed to say in his victim impact statement at Ethan's sentencing. But as they walked away from the courthouse, he felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he'd been carrying for 18 months. It wasn't over, not really. He'd still have the nightmares. He'd still have the medical appointments. He'd still have the vision loss and the chronic pain. But at least now he had resources to deal with those challenges. And he had the satisfaction of knowing that the institution that had failed him would face consequences and would have to change. But there was one more chapter to this story. One more thread that needed to be resolved. 2 weeks after the settlement was announced, Jennifer Campos received a call from Assistant District Attorney Monica Reynolds. "Jennifer, I need to talk to you about something. It's related to Marcus's case, but it's a separate matter. Can you come to my office?" They met the next day. Reynolds looked tired but determined, her expression suggesting she had news that was both important and complicated. During the civil discovery process, Reynolds began, "Did you uncover any evidence related to Richard Caldwell's conduct beyond what we knew from the criminal case?" "Quite a bit, actually. He was deeply involved in pressuring the school to protect Ethan. He threatened board members, made donations contingent on favorable treatment, and even visited Connor O'Brien in jail to intimidate him." "Why?" "Because I've been building a case. Richard Caldwell died before we could charge him with witness intimidation related to the Connor O'Brien visit. But based on your civil discovery, I believe we have evidence to charge other people who helped him obstruct justice." Campos leaned forward. "Who are you thinking about?" "Patricia Caldwell and their family attorney, a man named Gregory Sullivan. The evidence suggests they were both involved in the scheme to tamper with evidence, the shoe swap, and in efforts to intimidate witnesses. Patricia knew about the plan to give Connor different shoes. She helped Richard coordinate the cover-up. And Sullivan, as their attorney, wasn't just providing legal advice. He was actively participating in obstruction. Those are serious charges." "They are. And here's the thing, I want to bring them. Richard Caldwell escaped accountability by dying. Ethan is in prison where he belongs. But there were other enablers, other people who helped cover up what happened and tried to prevent justice. They should face consequences too." Campos thought about this. "What would you need from me?" "Access to the civil discovery materials. The emails, the depositions, everything you uncovered about Patricia and Sullivan's involvement. I know some of it might be subject to confidentiality provisions from the settlement." "The settlement allows disclosure of evidence for law enforcement purposes," Campos interrupted. "I made sure of that. I'll get you everything we have." "Thank you." Reynolds paused. "I should tell you, this is going to be controversial. Patricia Caldwell is a widow. Her son is in prison. Her husband died. Some people will say going after her now is cruel, that she suffered enough. She helped cover up a hate crime," Campos said flatly. "She knew her son had nearly beaten someone to death, and instead of encouraging him to take responsibility, She helped him hide evidence and intimidate witnesses. That's not a grieving mother protecting her child. That's a criminal participating in obstruction of justice. I agree. I just wanted you to know what we're walking into. 3 weeks later, on a cold morning in February, almost 2 years after the attack on Marcus Johnson, Patricia Caldwell was arrested at her home on charges of obstruction of justice and conspiracy to tamper with evidence. The arrest made national news. Patricia, now 54, looked nothing like the composed woman who'd sat in the courtroom during Ethan's trial. She'd lost weight. Her hair, which had always been professionally styled, was gray and pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked exhausted and broken. Her arraignment was brief. She pleaded not guilty and was released on bail. But the evidence against her was strong. Emails showing she'd known about the shoe swap, testimony from Connor O'Brien about her presence during discussions of the cover-up, and evidence that she'd helped Richard threaten witnesses. Gregory Sullivan, the family attorney, was charged separately. His case was more complicated because of attorney-client privilege issues, but prosecutors argued that his conduct crossed the line from legal advice into active participation in crimes. The cases proceeded through the spring. Patricia's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, arguing that she'd been manipulated by her husband, that she'd been trying to protect her son, that she'd already lost everything and didn't deserve prison time. But Monica Reynolds was unmoved. She made choices. She chose to help cover up a hate crime rather than encourage her son to take responsibility. She chose to participate in witness intimidation. Those were active choices and they have consequences. In April, unable to reach a favorable plea deal, Patricia Caldwell pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice in exchange for the conspiracy charge being dropped. She faced up to 5 years in prison. Her sentencing hearing was scheduled for June, 2 years, almost to the day after the attack on Marcus Johnson. The courtroom was far less crowded than it had been for Ethan's sentencing. The media had largely moved on. The public's attention had shifted to other cases, other tragedies. But Marcus attended, sitting in the back row with his mother, wanting to see this final chapter close. Patricia stood before Judge McNally, the same judge who'd sentenced Ethan, looking small and defeated. Her attorney made an impassioned plea for leniency. "Your Honor, Mrs. Caldwell has lost everything. Her husband is dead. Her son is in prison. Her reputation is destroyed. Her finances are in ruins. She lives alone in a small apartment, working part-time at a retail job just to pay rent. She's 54 years old with no criminal history. Sending her to prison serves no purpose. She's not a danger to society. She's a broken woman who made terrible mistakes trying to protect her son." Judge McNally listened without expression. Then he turned to Patricia. "Mrs. Caldwell, do you wish to make a statement?" Patricia nodded, her hands shaking as she unfolded a piece of paper. "Your Honor, I want to start by saying that I'm sorry. I'm sorry to Marcus Johnson and his family for the pain my family caused. I'm sorry for my role in trying to cover up what my son did. I'm sorry for putting protecting my child above doing what was right. I was a bad mother. Not because I loved my son. Loving your child isn't wrong. But because I loved him the wrong way. I loved him without teaching him accountability. I loved him without teaching him that his actions have consequences. I loved him without teaching him that other people matter as much as he does. And when he did something terrible, instead of helping him face what he'd done, I helped him hide it. That was wrong. I can't undo what happened. I can't give Marcus back his health or his future. I can't bring back my husband. I can't get back the years my son will spend in prison. All I can do is accept responsibility for my choices and try to be a better person going forward. I deserve to be punished. I'm not asking for mercy I haven't earned. I just want Marcus and his family to know that I understand what we did to them. I understand that we took a talented, promising young man and nearly destroyed him because we couldn't accept that someone who looked different from us belonged in our world. That's a sin I'll carry for the rest of my life." She folded the paper and sat down, tears streaming down her face. Judge McNally was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke. "Mrs. Caldwell, I appreciate your statement. I believe your remorse is genuine. But remorse doesn't excuse conduct. You weren't a passive bystander in this tragedy. You were an active participant in obstructing justice. You knew your son had committed a terrible crime, and instead of encouraging him to take responsibility, you helped him hide evidence and intimidate witnesses. The pre-sentence report recommends probation, citing your lack of criminal history and the losses you've suffered. Your attorney argues that you've been punished enough by life circumstances. But I have to consider the message that would send. If wealthy, privileged defendants and their families learn that they can obstruct justice and face no real consequences as long as they eventually express remorse, then we have a two-tiered system of justice. Marcus Johnson was beaten nearly to death. He lost his scholarship, his health, his sense of safety. And in the immediate aftermath, when truth and accountability were most important, you chose to help cover up what happened. You chose to protect your son's interests over justice. That cannot be treated as a mere lapse in judgment. Judge McNally opened his sentencing file. On the charge of obstruction of justice, I sentence you to 3 years in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release. During your supervised release, you will complete 500 hours of community service working with organizations that combat racism and support hate crime victims. You will also be prohibited from profiting in any way from your story. No book deals, no media interviews for payment, nothing that would allow you to benefit from these crimes. Patricia closed her eyes, absorbing the sentence. 3 years. She'd be nearly 60 when she got out. But she didn't protest. She simply nodded. Additionally, Judge McNally continued, I'm ordering that any remaining assets from the Caldwell estate that haven't been distributed through bankruptcy proceedings be seized and added to the restitution payments owed to Marcus Johnson. If there are hidden assets, offshore accounts, properties held in trust, anything that was shielded from the civil settlement, I expect full disclosure and recovery. He looked at Patricia directly. Mrs. Caldwell, I hope you use your time in prison to reflect not just on your own actions, but on how you raised a son who believed he had the right to terrorize another human being because of the color of his skin. I hope you think about the privilege and entitlement that allowed your family to operate for years as if the rules didn't apply to you. And I hope you emerge from prison committed to doing better. The gavel came down. Patricia was led away in handcuffs, and this time there was no dramatic scene, no crying family members in the gallery. She walked out quietly, accepting her fate with a resignation that spoke to how completely her world had collapsed. Marcus watched her go, feeling neither triumph nor satisfaction. Just a quiet sense that this chapter was finally, truly closing. Outside the courthouse, Monica Reynolds found Marcus and his mother. Thank you for being here today, she said. I know these proceedings keep forcing you to relive everything. It's okay, Marcus said. I needed to see it through to the end. The system isn't perfect, Reynolds said. It took too long. There were too many people who enabled what happened. But in the end, everyone who participated in hurting you or covering up what happened has faced consequences. That doesn't happen as often as it should. Marcus nodded. He thought about the journey from that night in the warehouse to this moment. Ethan was in prison. Connor, Dylan, and Trevor were in prison. Patricia was going to prison. Gregory Sullivan would face his own trial. Vice Principal Henderson had been fired after the independent investigation. Principal Brennan had resigned under pressure. Lincoln Prep had paid millions in settlement and was under federal oversight. It was accountability. Not perfect, not complete, but real. What are you going to do now? Reynolds asked. Marcus smiled slightly. I'm enrolling at Community College of Philadelphia next semester. I can't handle a full course load at a university yet, but I can take 2 classes. I'm going to study criminal justice. Eventually, maybe I'll become a victim advocate. Help other people navigate what I went through. That's wonderful, Marcus. You're going to help a lot of people. As Reynolds walked away, Diane put her arm around her son. I'm proud of you, baby. You could have given up 100 times, but you kept fighting. I had you, Marcus said simply. I couldn't have done any of this without you. They walked to their car, a newer model purchased with part of the settlement money. Diane had quit her second job. They'd moved into a better apartment. Marcus had a college fund now, and a trust that would provide for his medical needs for life. The money couldn't undo what had happened, but it gave them breathing room, security, a foundation to build on. As they drove home, Marcus looked out the window at Philadelphia passing by. It was the same city where he'd almost died 2 years ago. The same city where he'd been told repeatedly that his complaints didn't matter, that he was being too sensitive, that he should just accept his place. But it was also the city where justice had eventually been served. Where Jennifer Campos had fought for him. Where Monica Reynolds had prosecuted his attackers and their enablers. Where Judge Foster and Judge McNally and Judge Holloway had refused to let wealth and privilege shield people from consequences. The system was flawed. It was slow, often unfair, frequently weighted in favor of the powerful. But it wasn't completely broken. Sometimes, if you fought hard enough, if you had good people in your corner, if you refused to give up, you could win. 3 months later, in September, Marcus walked into his first class at Community College of Philadelphia. Introduction to Criminal Justice, taught by a retired police detective named Sarah Chen, the same Detective Chen who'd investigated his case. She recognized him immediately when he walked in. "Marcus Johnson," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "I didn't expect to see you in my class." "I want to understand the system," Marcus said. "How it works, where it fails, how to make it better." Detective Chen smiled. "Then you're in the right place. Take a seat." The class was small, maybe 20 students, a mix of young people fresh out of high school and older adults returning to education. Marcus sat near the back, his notebook open, ready to learn. Detective Chen began with a question. "Why do you all want to study criminal justice? What draws you to this field?" Students offered various answers. Some wanted to be police officers. Some wanted to be lawyers. Some were interested in forensic science. When it was Marcus's turn, he spoke carefully. "I want to study criminal justice because I've seen it from the victim's side. I know what it's like to be failed by the system, and I know what it's like when the system finally works. I want to help make sure it works more often for more people." Detective Chen nodded approvingly. "That's a good answer. The best criminal justice professionals are the ones who've seen the system's flaws firsthand and are committed to fixing them." She launched into her first lecture, covering the basics of the American justice system, criminal versus civil law, the roles of different actors, the constitutional protections for defendants and victims. Marcus took notes furiously, absorbing everything. This was his new path. Not the one he'd planned, not engineering, not Temple University, not the future he'd dreamed about as a freshman at Lincoln Prep. But a path nonetheless. One built from the ruins of what had been taken from him. Over the following months, Marcus threw himself into his studies. He couldn't handle a full course load yet. The headaches and concentration issues from his traumatic brain injury made that impossible. But he took 2 classes per semester and excelled in both. He also began volunteering with a nonprofit organization called the Victim Advocacy Center, which provided support and resources to people who'd experienced violent crimes. His role was simple: meeting with victims, listening to their stories, helping them navigate the legal system, connecting them with attorneys and therapists and support groups. The work was emotionally difficult. Every story reminded him of his own trauma. Every victim he met was a mirror reflecting his own pain back at him. But it was also deeply meaningful. He could help in ways that others couldn't because he'd walked the same path. One afternoon in November, almost 2.5 years after the attack, Marcus was at the Victim Advocacy Center when a young woman came in. She was 16, black, with braids and a backpack covered in protest pins. Her name was Destiny, and she'd been referred by a guidance counselor at her high school. "I'm not sure I'm in the right place," Destiny said nervously. "I haven't been, attacked or anything. There's this boy at school who keeps harassing me. Saying racist stuff, following me in the halls, posting things about me online. And the school won't do anything. They keep saying it's not their problem if it happens on social media, even though he's talking about me to other students at school." Marcus felt his heart rate increase. This was his story. This was how it had started for him. "You're in the right place," he said gently. "Tell me everything." Destiny poured out her story. The harassment had been going on for 6 months. She'd reported it to teachers, to administrators, to her guidance counselor. Every time she'd been told to ignore it, to not engage, to develop thicker skin. The boy harassing her came from a wealthy family that donated to the school. Nothing ever happened to him. "I'm scared it's going to get worse," Destiny said. "I feel like every day he's testing to see what he can get away with. And nobody's stopping him." Marcus knew that feeling. The slow escalation. The sense that something terrible was building and no one was paying attention. "Here's what we're going to do," Marcus said, pulling out a notebook. "First, we're going to document everything. Every incident, every time you report it, every response from the school. Dates, times, witnesses, everything. Second, I'm going to connect you with an attorney who specializes in civil rights cases and education. Third, we're going to make sure your parents understand their rights and the school's obligations under federal law." Will that actually help? Or will they just ignore that too? It'll help. Because once the school knows you have legal representation and you're documenting everything, they'll understand that if something happens to you, they're going to be held accountable. That changes their calculation. Marcus spent the next hour walking Destiny through the process, giving her resources, connecting her with Jennifer Campos's office. He saw the fear in her eyes slowly transform into something else, not confidence exactly, but determination. The sense that she didn't have to accept this, that she had options, that someone was in her corner. As Destiny left, Marcus felt something powerful. This was why he'd survived. Not just to recover and move on with his life, but to use what he'd learned to help others. To be the advocate he'd needed but hadn't had until after the worst had already happened. Over the following year, Marcus's work with the Victim Advocacy Center expanded. He began speaking at schools about recognizing the warning signs of harassment and the importance of reporting it. He testified before the Philadelphia School Board about the need for better harassment policies. He was interviewed by local news outlets about his experience and his advocacy work. And slowly, gradually, he built a new life. Not the life he'd planned, but a meaningful one nonetheless. He continued his education, eventually transferring to Temple University, the school where he'd lost his original scholarship. But this time, Temple offered him a new scholarship, one specifically created for students who'd overcome significant adversity. He majored in criminal justice with a minor in African American studies. He maintained regular therapy, processing his trauma, learning to manage his PTSD. The nightmares never completely went away, but they became less frequent, less intense. He stayed in touch with Jordan Webb, the student whose investigation of the Shoelace had exposed Ethan's evidence tampering. Jordan was now in college studying forensic science, inspired by their role in uncovering the truth. And remarkably, Marcus eventually reconnected with some of his former classmates from Lincoln Prep, the ones who'd witnessed the harassment but had been too afraid to speak up at the time. Many of them reached out to apologize, to express guilt about their silence, to ask how they could do better. Marcus was gracious in these conversations. He understood fear. He understood the power dynamics that made it dangerous to challenge people like Ethan Caldwell. He didn't forgive easily, but he accepted the apologies and moved forward. Lincoln Prep itself underwent dramatic changes. The reforms mandated by the settlement weren't cosmetic. They were substantive and enforced. The school hired a new principal, a black woman named Dr. Angela Morrison, who'd previously led a successful reform effort at another private school. She took the job on the condition that she'd have complete authority to remake the school's culture. Dr. Morrison implemented comprehensive anti-racism training for all staff. She created a student advisory board that gave minority students real voice in school policy. She established transparent procedures for handling harassment complaints, with an independent ombudsman reviewing all cases. And she expanded the scholarship program, increasing the percentage of students from underrepresented backgrounds from 15% to 35%. Were there wealthy families who objected to these changes? Absolutely. Did some donors withdraw their support? Yes. Did some parents pull their children from the school, complaining that it had become too political or too focused on diversity? They did. But Dr. Morrison held firm, backed by a board of trustees that had been largely replaced in the wake of the scandal. And gradually, Lincoln Prep began to transform from an institution that had enabled racism into one that actively fought it. 3 years after the attack, Marcus was invited to speak at Lincoln Prep's graduation ceremony. It was an unusual choice. Typically, graduation speakers were distinguished alumni or notable public figures. But Dr. Morrison felt it was important for the school to confront its past publicly. Marcus almost declined. The thought of returning to Lincoln Prep, of walking those halls where he'd been tormented, was terrifying. But his therapist encouraged him to consider it. It might be healing, Dr. Chin suggested. Not for them, for you. Taking back that space. Showing yourself that you survived and thrived despite what they did to you. So Marcus accepted. On a warm June evening, he stood at a podium in Lincoln Prep's auditorium, looking out at an audience of graduating seniors, their families, faculty, and administrators. The last time he'd been in this building, he'd been a terrified 16-year-old being called slurs in the hallways. Now he was 20, a college student, a victim advocate, a survivor. He began his speech. When I was invited to speak here tonight, my first instinct was to say no. This building holds painful memories for me. Within these walls, I was harassed, bullied, and made to feel like I didn't belong. Within these walls, I repeatedly asked for help and was told my experiences weren't real or weren't important enough to address. Within these walls, I learned that in certain spaces, the color of my skin would matter more than my character or my accomplishments. But I'm standing here tonight because I want to talk to the graduating class about what comes after pain. About how you build a life from ruins. About how you transform trauma into purpose. 3 years ago, I was attacked by students from this school. I nearly died. I lost my scholarship, my health, and my sense of safety in the world. 4 months afterward, I was angry, at my attackers, at the school, at a system that had failed to protect me. That anger was justified. It was real. And I want to be clear, what happened to me wasn't my fault. I didn't cause it by being too sensitive or not fitting in. I was targeted because of racism, pure and simple. But I also had a choice about what to do with that anger. I could let it consume me, or I could channel it into something constructive. I chose the latter. I chose to fight for accountability. I chose to use my story to help others. I chose to build a new future even though my planned future had been stolen. To the graduating seniors here tonight, especially the students of color, the scholarship students, the ones who sometimes feel like you don't quite belong in spaces like this, I want you to know that you do belong. You belong anywhere you have the talent and the drive to be. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Don't let anyone make you small. But I also want you to know that the world isn't always fair. You're going to encounter racism, discrimination, and people who have power they didn't earn and don't deserve. You're going to face situations where the system fails you. And in those moments, you have to decide who you're going to be. My advice? Be someone who fights back. Be someone who demands accountability. Be someone who refuses to accept that injustice is inevitable. But also be someone who heals, who builds community, who helps others who are facing what you faced. I'm not going to stand here and say everything happens for a reason. What happened to me was senseless and cruel. But I can say that I've found meaning in the aftermath. I've found purpose in advocacy. I found strength I didn't know I had. Lincoln Prep failed me. But this school is also trying to do better. The reforms that have been implemented here, the training, the oversight, the expanded scholarship programs, those exist because people fought for them. Because my mother and I and our attorney refused to accept that institutions can harm people without facing consequences. Change is possible. Accountability is possible. Justice is possible. It's not easy and it's not quick, but it's possible. So to the class of 2026, I say this: go out into the world and be agents of change. Be people who stand up for what's right even when it's hard. Be people who use whatever privilege and power you have to protect those who are vulnerable. Be people who refuse to be bystanders when you witness injustice. And if you fail, and you will fail sometimes because we all do, learn from it. Apologize. Make amends. Do better. Thank you for letting me speak tonight. I wish you all success and happiness. But more than that, I wish you purpose and integrity. May you build lives that matter. The auditorium was silent for a moment after Marcus finished speaking. Then someone started clapping, Dr. Morrison standing in the front row. The applause spread, growing louder, until the entire auditorium was on its feet. Marcus looked out at the standing ovation, and for the first time since the attack, he felt something close to peace. Not because the past had been erased or forgotten, but because he'd taken his story and turned it into something that might help others. Because he'd survived. Because he'd refused to let what happened to him define the totality of who he was. After the ceremony, several students approached Marcus. Some wanted to thank him for his speech. Others wanted advice about handling harassment they were experiencing. A few wanted to apologize. They'd been at Lincoln Prep during Marcus's time there, had witnessed some of the harassment, and were carrying guilt about their silence. One young man, a white senior named Tyler, approached Marcus nervously. "Mr. Johnson, I just wanted to say, I was friends with Ethan. Not close friends, but we played basketball together, hung out sometimes. And I saw some of the things he did to you. I heard the things he said. And I never spoke up. I never told a teacher or tried to stop him. I was afraid of becoming a target myself, of losing my social status. But that's not an excuse. I should have done something. I'm sorry." Marcus looked at Tyler, this nervous 18-year-old carrying the weight of his own complicity. "Thank you for apologizing," Marcus said. "That takes courage. What are you going to do differently going forward?" "I'm going to be braver. I'm going to speak up when I see injustice. I'm going to use my privilege, and I do have privilege, I understand that now, to protect people who don't have the same advantages I have." "That's good. That's all any of us can do, try to be better than we were." As Marcus left Lincoln Prep that night, walking through the parking lot where he'd once been followed and harassed, he felt a sense of closure. Not complete. Trauma doesn't resolve neatly. But enough to move forward without constantly looking back. The story could have ended there. But there was one final chapter, one last piece of the narrative that needed resolution. In prison, Ethan Caldwell was struggling. Prison is difficult for everyone, but it's especially difficult for young, privileged inmates who've never faced real hardship. Ethan had been moved to a medium-security facility in central Pennsylvania, far from Philadelphia, far from anything familiar. His mother visited once a month, but those visits were strained and painful. She was in federal prison herself now, and they saw each other through glass partitions, both of them serving time for crimes connected to that night in June 3 years ago. Ethan had been assaulted twice by other inmates who'd seen news coverage of his case and decided a racist rich kid deserved a beating. He'd spent time in protective custody. He'd struggled with depression and had been placed on suicide watch at one point. But something was also shifting in him. Maybe it was the therapy sessions mandated by the court. Maybe it was the racial justice programming he'd been required to attend. Maybe it was simply the grinding reality of years behind bars, forcing him to confront who he'd been and what he'd done. He'd started reading books about racism, about white privilege, about the history of violence against Black Americans. He'd begun corresponding with a professor of African American studies who volunteered with the prison education program. He joined a restorative justice circle where inmates discussed their crimes and their journeys toward understanding the harm they'd caused. And slowly, painfully, Ethan began to truly understand. Not the surface-level understanding he'd performed during his sentencing. Not the, "I'm sorry I got caught" remorse. But a deep, bone-level comprehension of the enormity of what he'd done. He tried to destroy another human being because of the color of his skin. He'd planned it, executed it, and then tried to cover it up. He'd used his privilege and his family's wealth to avoid accountability for as long as possible. And even after he was caught, even after he was convicted, he'd minimized his own culpability, tried to shift blame to others. He'd been a monster. Maybe he still was. But he wanted to be better. In the 4th year of his incarceration, Ethan did something difficult. He wrote a letter to Marcus Johnson. He didn't send it through the prison system. Marcus had a protective order preventing Ethan from contacting him directly. Instead, Ethan gave the letter to his therapist, who contacted Jennifer Campos, who contacted Marcus to ask if he'd be willing to receive communication from Ethan. Marcus's first instinct was to refuse. Why would he want to hear from the person who'd nearly killed him? What could Ethan possibly say that would matter? But his therapist encouraged him to at least read the letter before deciding whether to respond. "You don't owe him anything," Dr. Chin said. But sometimes, hearing an acknowledgement from your abuser can be part of the healing process. If it's genuine acknowledgement, not manipulation. So Marcus agreed to receive the letter. It arrived at Jennifer Campos's office, reviewed by her first to ensure it wasn't manipulative or threatening. She read it carefully, then called Marcus. "I think you should read this," she said. "It's different from his previous statements." Marcus came to her office and read the letter. It was 10 pages, handwritten, and it began. "Marcus, I don't expect you to read this. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect anything from you because I haven't earned anything and I never will. But I need to say things that I should have said years ago, and I need to say them with honesty I didn't have before. What I did to you was evil. I've spent 4 years trying to find softer words. Wrong, terrible, a mistake. But those words minimize the truth. Evil is the accurate word. I tried to destroy you because I believed, deep in my core, that you were less human than me. I believed that because you were Black, you didn't deserve the opportunities one had. I believed that your presence at Lincoln Prep was an insult to me and to people like me. I believed these things not because they were true, but because I'd been taught them explicitly and implicitly my entire life. That's not an excuse. It's an explanation. I was raised in an environment where racism was normalized, where privilege was unexamined, where people like you were dismissed and dehumanized. My parents taught me these things, sometimes with words and often with actions. The school enabled these beliefs by refusing to confront them. My friends reinforced them. And I absorbed all of it and let it turn me into someone capable of attempting murder. I understand now what I couldn't understand then, that racism isn't just personal prejudice. It's a system. And I was a product of that system, benefiting from it, perpetuating it, using it as a weapon against you. Here's what I want you to know, Marcus. You didn't deserve any of what I did to you. Not the slurs, not the harassment, not the assault. You deserve to be safe. You deserve to be welcomed. You deserve to pursue your education without fear. You deserve to be treated with the same dignity and respect that I took for granted. I took that from you. I took your health, your scholarship, your sense of safety. I took your future and tried to replace it with trauma. And no apology, no amount of prison time, nothing I could do for the rest of my life will ever make that right. But I want to try to do something. I don't know what yet. Maybe there's nothing I can do that would matter to you. But I'm committing myself to learning, to growing, to becoming someone different from who I was. I'm educating myself about racism and white supremacy. I'm participating in restorative justice programs. I'm trying to understand the depth of the harm I caused. And someday, if I ever get out of prison, I want to dedicate my life to undoing the kind of harm I caused. Teaching other young white men about the dangers of privilege and prejudice. working to dismantle the systems that create people like I was, making sure other people don't have to experience what you experienced. I don't expect you to care about my redemption arc. You don't owe me forgiveness or encouragement or acknowledgement. Your only obligation was to survive what I did to you, and you've done that. You've done more than that. You've built a meaningful life despite what I took from you. I follow your advocacy work from prison. I read about your speeches, your testimony before the school board, your work with other victims. You've turned your trauma into something that helps people. That's extraordinary. I don't deserve to know you or to receive anything from you. But if you're ever willing to engage in any kind of dialogue, through a mediator, through letters, through any means that feels safe to you, I would welcome it. Not because I deserve it, but because I want to hear from you directly what my actions took from you. I want to understand fully, in your words, the depth of the harm I caused. If you're not willing to engage, I understand completely. This letter is not a request. It's an acknowledgement. You exist. You matter. You deserved better. And I failed you catastrophically. I'm sorry. I know those words are inadequate. I know they don't fix anything. But they're true. Ethan. Marcus read the letter twice, then set it down and stared out the window of Campos's office. He felt a complicated swirl of emotions. Anger that Ethan thought a letter could matter, skepticism about whether the remorse was genuine, and underneath it all, a tiny flicker of something that might have been the beginning of forgiveness. Not forgiveness for what Ethan had done. That was unforgivable. But maybe forgiveness for who Ethan had been, a young man raised in a sick system, taught toxic values, and turned into a weapon. Maybe there was space to acknowledge that Ethan had been both a perpetrator and, in some ways, a product of the same systemic racism that had targeted Marcus. What do you think? Campos asked gently. I think he's trying. I don't know if it's real or if it's just him trying to feel better about himself. But it sounds different from before. Do you want to respond? Marcus thought about it. Did he owe Ethan anything? No. Would responding help Marcus heal? Maybe. Not yet, he decided. Maybe someday. But not yet. I need more time. That's fair. Marcus left Campos's office with the letter in his bag. He didn't throw it away. He kept it, along with all the other documents from this chapter of his life. Someday maybe he'd respond. Maybe he'd participate in some kind of restorative justice process with Ethan. Or maybe he'd never speak to him again. Either way was okay. Because Marcus had learned something important. His healing didn't depend on Ethan's redemption. He could build a meaningful life whether Ethan ever changed or not. 5 years after the attack, Marcus Johnson graduated from Temple University with a degree in criminal justice and a minor in African American studies. He graduated with honors despite the cognitive challenges from his traumatic brain injury. His mother sat in the audience, tears streaming down her face, watching her son walk across the stage and accept his diploma, the diploma that Ethan Caldwell had tried to ensure he'd never receive. After graduation, Marcus was accepted into a master's program in social work at the University of Pennsylvania. His focus would be on trauma-informed victim advocacy. He'd received a full scholarship funded by a Philadelphia philanthropist who'd been moved by his story. He also accepted a position at the Victim Advocacy Center, where he'd been volunteering for years. His new role would be Director of Youth Services, overseeing programs specifically designed to help young people who'd experienced violence. His life had taken a shape he never could have imagined as that excited freshman walking into Lincoln Prep for the first time. He'd lost the future he'd planned. But he'd built a different future. One rooted in purpose, in service, in using his pain to help others. And Lincoln Prep continued its transformation. Dr. Morrison had been principal for 4 years now, and the school was unrecognizable from what it had been. The student body was more diverse. The curriculum included extensive education about racism, privilege, and social justice. The harassment reporting system was robust and actually enforced. Were there still problems? Of course. Racism doesn't disappear overnight, and wealthy institutions don't change easily. But the trajectory was positive. The school was trying. And in some small way, Marcus's suffering had catalyzed meaningful reform. On the 5th anniversary of the attack, Marcus was invited to participate in a panel discussion at a conference on preventing hate crimes in schools. The panel included educators, law enforcement officials, victims advocates, and reformed perpetrators. Sitting on the panel, 3 seats away from Marcus, was someone unexpected, Connor O'Brien. Connor had been released from prison 8 months earlier, after serving 8 years of his sentence. He'd aged significantly, prison had hardened him, given him a wariness that hadn't been there before. But he'd also changed in other ways. He'd gotten his GED in prison. He'd participated in extensive racial justice programming. He'd written letters of apology to Marcus and his family. When Marcus saw Connor's name on the panel list, his first reaction had been anger. He'd called the conference organizers and complained. Why was his attacker being given a platform to speak about preventing hate crimes? Wasn't that obscene? But the organizer had explained, Connor's part of a program for reformed hate crime perpetrators. He speaks to young people about how he got radicalized, what led him to participate in violence, and how he's worked to de-radicalize himself. His perspective is valuable because he can reach young men who might be on the same path he was on. Marcus had reluctantly agreed to stay on the panel, on the condition that he wouldn't be required to interact with Connor personally. The panel discussion was moderated by a professor of criminology from Temple. Each panelist spoke about their experiences and perspectives. When it was Connor's turn, he spoke hesitantly but honestly. I was 18 when I participated in the attack on Marcus Johnson. I'm 26 now. I've spent the time in between trying to understand how I became someone capable of that kind of violence. And the answer is complicated. I was raised in an environment where casual racism was normal. I was socialized into toxic masculinity that valued aggression and dominance. I was in a peer group where hurting Marcus was framed as a joke, as putting someone in their place, not as attempted murder. None of that excuses what I did. I made choices. I chose to participate. I chose to kick a defenseless person in the face and destroy his vision. I chose to laugh about it afterward. Those were my choices and I have to live with them. But I also want to talk about how we create people like I was. Because I wasn't born believing black people were inferior. I wasn't born thinking violence was acceptable. I learned those things. And if we want to prevent future hate crimes, we need to intervene in the systems that teach young people these toxic beliefs. I speak now at schools and juvenile justice facilities. I talk to young men who remind me of who I was. And I tell them, the path I went down leads nowhere good. It leads to destroying someone else's life and destroying your own. It leads to prison and guilt and spending the rest of your life trying to atone for something that can't be atoned for. I can't undo what I did to Marcus. I can't give him back what I took. But I can try to prevent the next Marcus from being attacked. I can try to reach the next Connor before he makes the choices I made. That's my responsibility now. When Connor finished speaking, Marcus was surprised to find himself moved. Not forgiveness, he still wasn't there, might never be there. But a recognition that Connor was genuinely trying to do better. That he was using his experience to potentially help others. During the Q&A session, a high school student in the audience raised her hand. This question is for Mr. Johnson. How do you feel sitting on a panel with someone who hurt you so badly? Don't you hate him? Marcus thought carefully before responding. That's a good question. The honest answer is, it's complicated. Do I hate Connor? Sometimes. When I wake up from nightmares of that night, when I look in the mirror and see my blind eye, when I think about the scholarship and the future I lost, yeah, in those moments I feel hatred. But I also recognize that Connor was 19 years old, influenced by terrible people and toxic beliefs. He made evil choices, but I don't think he was an evil person. I think he was a person who got caught up in evil and didn't have the moral courage to resist it. And seeing him here today, hearing him talk about the work he's doing to prevent other people from making the same choices he made, I don't know if I can forgive him. That's a complicated question I'm still working through with my therapist. But I can respect that he's trying to do better. I can acknowledge that his perspective might help other potential victims avoid what I went through. So no, I don't hate him. I'm hurt by him. I'm forever changed by what he did. But hate takes energy, and I'd rather use that energy to build something positive than to feed hatred. After the panel ended, Marcus was gathering his materials when Connor approached him, staying several feet away, clearly nervous. Marcus, I don't want to intrude on your space. I just wanted to say that I heard what you said up there and I appreciate it. I know you don't owe me anything. I wanted you to know that everything I said was true. I really am trying to do better. To be better. Marcus looked at Connor, really looked at him for the first time since that night in the warehouse. He saw the scars, the wariness, the weight of guilt that Connor would carry for the rest of his life. He saw someone broken by his own choices, trying to piece together some kind of redemption. I heard you, Marcus said quietly. And I believe you're trying. That doesn't erase what you did. But it's something. That's more than I deserve. Thank you. Connor turned to leave, but Marcus surprised himself by speaking again. Connor. What you did that night, the kick that destroyed my vision, I need you to understand something. That moment changed everything for me. Every day I live with the consequences of what you did. Every day I adjust to being partially blind. Every day I remember. Connor's face crumpled. I know. I'm so sorry. Let me finish. I'm not telling you this to hurt you. I'm telling you because if you're going to speak to kids about preventing violence, you need to keep the reality of what you did at the forefront of your mind. You need to remember that violence isn't abstract. It has real victims with real consequences. The work you're doing is important, but only if it comes from genuine understanding of the harm you caused, not from wanting to feel better about yourself. I understand. I'll remember. Good. Then keep doing the work. Marcus walked away, leaving Connor standing there. He felt lighter somehow, as if speaking that truth directly to one of his attackers had released something he'd been carrying. Outside the conference center, Marcus's mother was waiting for him in their car. She'd attended the panel, sitting in the back row, watching her son speak with pride and pain. "How are you feeling, baby?" she asked as he got in the car. "Tired, but okay. It was good, I think. Hard but good. I'm proud of you. Sitting up there with that boy who hurt you, staying calm, being articulate about your experience, that took strength." "I learned from the best," Marcus said, squeezing her hand. They drove in comfortable silence for a while. Then Diane spoke again. "Your father would be proud of you too." Marcus's father had died when Marcus was 12, a heart attack, sudden and devastating. He'd been a construction worker, a good man who'd worked hard to provide for his family. He'd never lived to see Marcus get the scholarship to Lincoln Prep, never seen the attack or the trials or the advocacy work. "I wish he could have seen all this," Marcus said. "He sees it. I believe that. And I know he's proud." That evening, Marcus returned to his apartment, a modest one-bedroom in West Philadelphia, paid for with money from the settlement. He made dinner, studied for his graduate school classes, and prepared for a presentation he was giving the next day at a high school about recognizing and reporting harassment. It was an ordinary evening in an extraordinary life. A life built from trauma, yes, but also from resilience and purpose and determination to make meaning from suffering. Before bed, Marcus did something he'd started doing every night in therapy. He wrote in a journal about 3 positive things from the day. It was a practice designed to help reframe his thinking, to remind him that life contained more than just trauma and pain. Today he wrote, 1. The panel went well. I was able to speak my truth without breaking down, and maybe I helped some people understand what it's like to be a victim of hate crimes. 2. I saw Connor and didn't feel overwhelming hatred. Maybe that means I'm healing. 3. Mom told me Dad would be proud. I hope she's right. He closed the journal and turned off the light, settling into bed. The nightmares still came sometimes. The fear still surfaced. The anger still flared. But these things no longer defined his entire existence. They were parts of his story but not the whole story. 6 years after the attack, Marcus Johnson stood in Judge Foster's federal courtroom once more. But this time he wasn't there as a plaintiff or a victim. He was there as an expert witness in another case, a lawsuit by a Latino student who'd been harassed at a different Philadelphia private school and who'd been failed by administrators in ways that eerily mirrored Marcus's experience. Jennifer Campos was representing the student too, and she'd asked Marcus to testify about his experience and about the patterns he'd observed in how schools handle harassment complaints. As Marcus took the stand and was sworn in, he looked out at the courtroom. In the gallery sat students and parents from multiple schools, all of them watching to see if justice would be served again. At the plaintiff's table sat a 15-year-old boy named Miguel whose story was heartbreakingly similar to Marcus's own. "Mr. Johnson," Campos began, "thank you for being here today. Can you tell the court about your experience at Lincoln Preparatory Academy?" And Marcus told his story again. Not because he enjoyed reliving it, he didn't, but because his story had power. It had the power to validate other victims' experiences. It had the power to demonstrate patterns of institutional failure. It had the power to push for accountability and change. He'd learned that his trauma could be transformative, not just for him but for others. Every time he spoke, every time he testified, every time he helped another victim navigate the legal system, he was taking what had been done to him and using it as a tool to prevent it from happening to others. That was his legacy. Not the attack itself, but what he'd built from its ashes. The case Marcus testified in eventually settled for $8 million and resulted in another round of court-mandated reforms at another school. Miguel, the plaintiff, went on to graduate and attend college. The school's principal was fired. Real change happened. And Marcus continued his work, graduating with his master's degree, becoming a licensed clinical social worker specializing in trauma, and eventually founding his own nonprofit organization, the Shoelace Project. Named after the small detail that had exposed Ethan Caldwell's lies and cover-up, the Shoelace Project provided free advocacy services to young people who'd experienced hate crimes or harassment in educational settings. The organization helped victims navigate the legal system, connected them with attorneys, provided therapy referrals, and advocated for policy changes at schools. Jordan Webb, who discovered the Shoelace evidence, became the organization's director of investigations, helping gather evidence in cases where schools were failing to protect students. Within 3 years, the Shoelace Project had helped over 200 families and had successfully advocated for policy changes at dozens of schools across Pennsylvania and neighboring states. Marcus became a recognized expert in the field, frequently invited to speak at conferences, to testify before legislative committees, and to consult with schools on improving their harassment response protocols. He also began teaching adjunct courses at Temple University on victimology and restorative justice. His students were inspired by his story, but even more inspired by his commitment to transforming systems rather than just helping individual victims. And slowly, painfully, Marcus began to think about the question of forgiveness. Not forgiveness as absolution, not forgiveness as forgetting, but forgiveness as a release, letting go of the hatred that took up space in his heart, making room for other emotions. 7 years after the attack, Marcus did something that surprised even himself. He accepted an invitation to participate in a restorative justice dialogue with Ethan Caldwell. Restorative justice is a process where victims and offenders meet, facilitated by trained mediators, to discuss the crime and its impact. The goal isn't reconciliation necessarily, but communication, giving the victim a chance to express their feelings directly and giving the offender a chance to take full accountability. The dialogue took place at the prison where Ethan was incarcerated. Marcus brought his mother and his therapist for support. Ethan was brought in wearing prison clothes, looking older than his 25 years, with a beard and a weariness that comes from years of incarceration. They sat across from each other at a table with 2 restorative justice facilitators present. The facilitators explained the ground rules. Marcus could speak for as long as he needed. Ethan would listen without interrupting. Then Ethan could respond. This wasn't about resolution or forgiveness, it was about truth-telling. Marcus began to speak. Ethan, I'm here today because my therapist thought it might help my healing process to say things directly to you that I've never had the chance to say. I don't know if this will help you, that's not my concern. This is for me. What you did to me that night 7 years ago didn't just hurt my body. It didn't just take away my scholarship and my vision and my sense of safety. It fundamentally changed how I see the world. Before that night, I believed that if I worked hard and was a good person, I'd be okay. I believed that the system would protect me. I believed that people in authority would do the right thing when I asked for help. You and your friends didn't just beat me with bats. You beat those beliefs out of me. You forced me to understand that in this world, the color of my skin would sometimes matter more than anything else about me. That people with money and privilege could harm me and face no immediate consequences. That institutions would sacrifice my safety to protect their donors. I live with the physical consequences every day. My vision, my headaches, my arm that aches when it rains. But the psychological consequences are worse. The nightmares. The hypervigilance. The way my heart races when I'm in a room with groups of white men. The way I flinch at sudden movements. The way I have to take anxiety medication just to function sometimes. You took my future. I was going to be an engineer. I was going to design bridges and buildings. That's gone now. My brain doesn't work the same way it did before you and your friends used it as a soccer ball. I've built a different life, a meaningful life, but it's not the life I chose. It's the life I was forced into by your violence. I need you to understand something, Ethan. You didn't just hurt me that night. You hurt my mother, who spent months sleeping in a hospital chair, who works extra shifts to help pay medical bills that insurance doesn't cover, who still wakes up from nightmares about losing her son. You hurt every black and brown student at Lincoln Prep who now understands that they're not really safe, that the school won't really protect them. You hurt your own friends, Connor, Dylan, Trevor, who are all in prison or struggling to rebuild their lives after you led them into violence. You even hurt your own mother, who's in prison because she helped you cover up your crimes. The damage you caused ripples outward in ways you probably can't even comprehend. And I need you to sit with that. I need you to really understand the scope of the harm you caused, not in an abstract way but concretely. So I'm going to tell you what a typical day in my life looks like now. I wake up and sometimes I don't remember immediately what happened. For a few seconds, I'm just a normal 24-year-old. Then I remember and I have to confront all over again that my life is divided into before and after. Before you nearly killed me and after. I take medication for headaches and anxiety. I do vision exercises for my damaged eye even though the doctors say it won't improve, because I have to feel like I'm trying to get better. I go to therapy twice a week, working through trauma that will probably never fully resolve. I go to work helping other victims, which is meaningful but also means I'm constantly re-traumatized by hearing stories similar to my own. I give testimony in court cases, which means reliving that night over and over. I speak at schools and conferences, which means making my pain public, making myself vulnerable to judgment and scrutiny. And through it all, I carry the knowledge that you and people like you exist in the world. That there are people who could look at me and see nothing but the color of my skin and decide I deserve to be hurt. That keeps me up at night, Ethan. The knowledge that the world contains that kind of hatred. I've read your letters. I know you say you've changed, that you understand now, that you're sorry. Maybe that's true. I hope it is, for whatever that's worth. But your remorse doesn't undo the damage. Your growth doesn't give me back my health or my original future. Your apologies don't stop my nightmares. So why am I here? Why did I agree to this dialogue? Because my therapist says that confronting you might help me let go of some of the anger I'm carrying. Because speaking these truths directly to you, rather than just in therapy or in court testimony, might give me a sense of closure. And because I want you to see me as a full human being, not as the victim in a case file, but as a real person whose life you irrevocably altered. I'm here to tell you that I survived. That despite everything you did to break me, I'm still here. I've built a life that matters. I help people. I make a difference. And the work I do exists specifically to prevent what you did from happening to others. So in a strange way, Ethan, your violence created its own opposition. Your hatred gave birth to my advocacy. And maybe that's the only meaning I can make from this, that from the worst thing that ever happened to me, I've created something that helps other people. That's what I needed to say to you. Now I'll listen to what you have to say if the facilitators think that's appropriate. Marcus sat back, emotionally exhausted from speaking. His mother squeezed his hand under the table. His therapist nodded encouragingly. The facilitators looked at Ethan, who had tears streaming down his face. Ethan, you may respond if you're ready, one facilitator said gently. Ethan took a shaky breath. Marcus, thank you for being here. Thank you for giving me the chance to hear directly from you about the harm I caused. I don't deserve this opportunity, but I'm grateful for it. Everything you said is true. All of it. The damage, the ripples, the way my violence affected not just you but everyone around you. I've spent 7 years thinking about this, reading your interviews and articles, following the work you do. And I'm constantly confronted with the reality that I did that. I created that pain. I'm responsible for all of it. You said you don't know if my remorse is genuine. I understand that skepticism. I lied for so long, to myself, to my family, to the courts, that even I'm not sure sometimes if what I'm feeling is genuine remorse or just guilt about getting caught. But I'm trying. I'm really trying to understand the depth of what I did and to become someone different. I've participated in every racial justice program the prison offers. I've read hundreds of books about racism, white supremacy, the history of violence against Black Americans. I've joined a restorative justice circle where I have to confront my crime over and over. I write letters to educational organizations about what led me to that night, trying to help prevent other young white men from going down the same path. But none of that undoes what I did to you. Nothing I could do would undo it. And I have to live with that knowledge every single day for the rest of my life. You asked me to understand the scope of the harm I caused. I've tried. I've really tried. But hearing it directly from you, hearing what a typical day in your life looks like now, hearing about your mother's nightmares and the other students I traumatized, I don't think I can truly understand. I can intellectually grasp it, but I'm not the one living with those consequences. You are. And that's a burden I can never fully comprehend because I'm not carrying it. What I can do is commit to never minimizing what I did, to never making excuses, to always acknowledging the full truth of that night and its aftermath, and to using the rest of my life, whether in prison or if I'm ever released on the outside, to work against the systems and beliefs that created me. Because you were right about one thing, I was created. I wasn't born hating you. I was taught. By my parents, by my social environment, by a culture that valorized whiteness and denigrated blackness. I absorbed all of that and I never questioned it. I never examined my own privilege or prejudice. I just accepted that the world was structured with people like me on top and people like you beneath us. And when you showed up at Lincoln Prep, confident and talented and not deferential, it threatened my worldview. So I tried to destroy you. That was evil. Not misguided, not a mistake evil. And I have to own that. You said your violence created its own opposition, that your advocacy grew from my hatred. I've thought about that a lot. And while I would give anything for you not to have needed to become an advocate, I'm grateful that you've turned your trauma into something that helps others. That's extraordinary. That's heroic. And it's so much more than I deserve to witness. I don't ask for your forgiveness. I don't think I deserve it. But I do want you to know that I see you. I see what you've built despite what I tried to take from you. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Ethan broke down completely, sobbing into his hands. The facilitators let him cry, let the emotion flow. Marcus watched without speaking, his own emotions complicated and intense. After several minutes, the facilitator spoke. Marcus, how are you feeling right now? Is there anything else you want to say or ask? Marcus thought about it. There was one question he'd always wanted to ask. Ethan, why me specifically? There were other black students at Lincoln Prep. Why did you fixate on me? Ethan wiped his eyes and looked at Marcus directly for the first time in the session. Because you didn't act the way I thought you should act. The other black students, and I hate saying this because it reveals how messed up my thinking was, they seemed grateful to be there. They seemed to understand they were there on sufferance. But you acted like you belonged. You were confident. You competed academically with white students and won. You dated. You joined activities. You acted like an equal. And that enraged me. Because in my twisted worldview you weren't equal. You were supposed to be grateful and subservient. And when you weren't, I wanted to punish you for it. Marcus nodded slowly. He'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was still painful. So it wasn't really about me at all. It was about your own insecurity and your need to enforce a hierarchy. Yes, exactly. And I'm so sorry that you bore the brunt of my pathology. The restorative justice session continued for another hour. They discussed what accountability meant, what Ethan could do to make amends, beyond his prison sentence, and what Marcus needed from this process. By the end, Marcus felt drained but also lighter. He'd said everything he needed to say. He'd looked his attacker in the eye and spoken his truth. And he'd seen genuine remorse, not the performative kind from the trial, but real, deep remorse that seemed to come from actual understanding. Did he forgive Ethan? Not entirely. Maybe not ever. But he felt he could let go of some of the anger, could stop carrying the hatred that had been poisoning him. As they were leaving, Ethan spoke one more time. Marcus, I know I said this in letters, but I want to say it directly. I'm following your work with the Shoelace project. What you're building is important. And if there's ever anything I can do to support it, testimony about how perpetrators think, education materials, anything, I'm available. Not to redeem myself, but because preventing others from experiencing what you experienced matters. Marcus considered this. Maybe. Someday. Right now, I need to process this session and figure out where I am with all of this. But I'll think about it. That's more than I deserve. Thank you. As Marcus left the prison with his mother and therapist, he felt something shift inside him. Not forgiveness exactly. Not reconciliation. But perhaps the beginning of release. Letting go of the grip that his trauma had on his daily life, making space for other emotions beyond anger and fear. How do you feel? His therapist asked as they drove back to Philadelphia. Exhausted. Sad. But also, okay. I think this was the right thing to do. You were incredibly brave in there. Confronting your attacker like that, with such clarity and honesty, that takes tremendous courage. I learned from the best, Marcus said, looking at his mother, who smiled through her tears. 8 years after the attack, Marcus Johnson was invited to give a TED Talk. The topic, Transforming Trauma into Purpose, How Victims Can Become Advocates. Standing on the red circle on the TED stage, looking out at an audience of thousands with millions more who would eventually watch online, Marcus told his story one more time. But this time he focused not on the violence itself but on what came after. He talked about the choice victims face, to let trauma define them, or to transform it into something meaningful. He talked about his work with the Shoelace Project and the hundreds of young people they'd helped. He talked about the importance of holding institutions accountable, not just individual perpetrators. He talked about restorative justice and the complicated journey toward forgiveness. And he ended with this. People often ask me if I've forgiven Ethan Caldwell. And my answer is, I'm working on it. Forgiveness isn't a destination, it's a process. And it's not about absolving the person who hurt you. It's about releasing yourself from the prison of hatred and anger. But here's what I want you to understand. My healing doesn't depend on Ethan's redemption. My purpose doesn't come from his apology. I've built a meaningful life not because of anything he's done since that night, but because of choices I made. Choices to fight for accountability. Choices to help others. Choices to transform my pain into purpose. If you've experienced trauma, and statistically most of you have in some form, you have the same choice. You can let it destroy you or you can let it transform you. Neither choice is easy. But transformation is possible. It doesn't mean forgetting what happened. It doesn't mean pretending it didn't hurt. It doesn't mean letting perpetrators off the hook. It means taking what was meant to break you and using it as a foundation to build something strong. That's what the Shoelace Project represents. A small detail that exposed a larger truth. And that's what trauma survivors do when we become advocates. We take our painful truths and use them to expose larger truths about justice, about accountability, about human resilience. So to everyone watching this who's survived something terrible, I see you. I believe you. And I want you to know that your trauma doesn't have to be the end of your story. It can be the beginning of a new chapter. One where you're not just a survivor but someone who helps others survive. Thank you. The audience stood in ovation. Marcus accepted the applause with gratitude but without letting it inflate his ego. This wasn't about him being special. It was about the universal human capacity to transform suffering into meaning. After the TED Talk aired, the Shoelace Project's funding doubled. They were able to expand into 3 new states. Marcus hired additional staff, including several other survivors of hate crimes who wanted to become advocates. Lincoln Prep established an annual scholarship in Marcus's name, full tuition for an underrepresented student who demonstrated resilience in the face of adversity. The first recipient was a young black woman who'd been harassed at her previous school and had found the courage to report it and seek accountability. And Marcus continued his work, helping victims, pushing for reform, teaching the next generation of social workers and advocates. 10 years after the attack, Marcus received news that Ethan Caldwell was being considered for parole. Under Pennsylvania law, Ethan had been sentenced to 27 to 42 years with possibility of parole after 27 years. But because of good behavior, educational achievements in prison, and participation in rehabilitation programs, he was eligible for early parole consideration after 15 years. As the victim, Marcus was invited to submit a statement to the parole board about whether Ethan should be released. It was a weighty responsibility. Marcus's statement could potentially influence whether Ethan served another 12 years or was released. He thought about it carefully. He consulted with his therapist, his mother, Jennifer Campos, and other survivors he'd worked with. He attended Ethan's parole hearing, listening as prison staff testified about Ethan's behavior, as the psychologist discussed Ethan's progress in therapy, as Ethan himself spoke about his remorse and his plans if released. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he stood before the parole board and said, "I'm here today to share my perspective on whether Ethan Caldwell should be released early. This is complicated for me because I still carry the scars, physical and psychological, of what he did. Every day I wake up partially blind. Every day I manage chronic pain. Every day I live with PTSD from that night 15 years ago. Part of me wants Ethan to serve every single day of his maximum sentence. That part of me thinks he deserves to lose decades of his life the way he stole possibilities from my life. That part of me is angry and wants punishment to be as harsh as possible. But I've spent the last decade working in restorative justice. I've seen how punitive approaches alone don't prevent future harm. I've seen how transformation is possible when people genuinely commit to change. And I've had the opportunity to participate in restorative dialogue with Ethan, to see him confront what he did with what appears to be genuine remorse. So here's my statement. I believe Ethan has made genuine efforts to change. I believe he understands the harm he caused in ways he didn't at the time of his sentencing. I believe he's educated himself and worked to become a different person. But I also believe he needs to demonstrate that transformation in the real world, not just in prison programs. I believe he needs to face the challenge of living in a society that knows what he did and holding himself accountable in that context. So I'm not opposing his release. But I am asking that if he's released, it come with conditions. Mandatory participation in anti-racism education programs, mandatory community service with organizations that combat hate crimes, and regular check-ins with a parole officer who understands the nature of his crimes. And I'm asking that he be required to stay away from me and my family unless I specifically agree to contact. I need to maintain my boundaries and my sense of safety. Whether Ethan has truly changed is something only time will tell. But I think he deserves the chance to prove it, not because he's earned it but because I believe in the possibility of redemption, even for people who've done terrible things. That's my statement. The parole board deliberated for a week before announcing their decision. Ethan Caldwell would be granted parole, subject to strict conditions including those Marcus had recommended, plus others. He would be released in 90 days, after completing a transitional program. The news sparked debate. Some people felt Ethan was being released too soon, that 15 years wasn't enough for what he'd done. Others argued that this demonstrated the justice system working as intended, punishment combined with rehabilitation with the possibility of reintegration for those who genuinely changed. Marcus tried to stay out of the public debate. His statement to the parole board had been his final word on the subject. Whether Ethan succeeded or failed upon release was Ethan's responsibility, not Marcus's. But privately, Marcus felt a sense of closure. The legal proceedings were finally, truly over. Ethan had been sentenced, had served substantial time, and was now being released under strict supervision. Patricia Caldwell had served her sentence and been released 2 years ago, now living quietly in another state. Connor, Dylan, and Trevor had all been released and were rebuilding their lives in various ways. The criminal justice chapter of Marcus's story was complete. And so, this story ends where it perhaps should have ended all along, not with vengeance or punishment but with transformation and purpose. Marcus Johnson, now 30 years old, continued his work with the Shoelace Project. He'd helped over 1,000 families navigate the aftermath of hate crimes. He'd testified before Congress about reforming how schools handle harassment. He'd trained thousands of educators, law enforcement officers, and victim advocates. He'd also found love, a fellow social worker named David whom he'd met at a conference. They'd been together for 3 years and were discussing marriage. He'd maintained his relationship with his mother, who was now retired and volunteering with the Shoelace Project, providing support to other parents of victims. He'd returned to Lincoln Prep multiple times, not as a victim but as a speaker, as a board member of their Equity Advisory Committee, as someone who'd transformed his trauma into institutional change. And he'd learned to live with his scars, physical and psychological, not as things that defined him but as parts of his story. A story of surviving, of fighting, of building something meaningful from ruins. The shoelace that had exposed Ethan's lies became a metaphor for Marcus's life. Sometimes the smallest details matter most. The small choices to keep going when everything seemed hopeless. The small acts of kindness from strangers who became allies. The small victories that accumulated into systemic change. And that's the real ending of this story, not perfect justice, because perfect justice doesn't exist in an imperfect world. But accountability, transformation, growth, and the understanding that even the worst moments of our lives don't have to be the final word on who we become. Marcus Johnson survived. More than that, he thrived. And in doing so, he proved that hate doesn't have to win. That privilege doesn't have to shield people from consequences. That institutions can be forced to change. And that trauma, while it leaves scars, doesn't have to destroy the possibility of a meaningful life. If you watched part 1 of this story, thank you for following Marcus's journey through to this conclusion. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, go back and watch how this all began, how a shoelace exposed the truth and set in motion a chain of events that would lead to accountability, reform, and ultimately this complicated but hopeful ending. Because that's what true crime stories should do. Not just show us the darkness, but also show us how people find light even in the darkest moments. How they fight. How they survive. How they transform pain into purpose. Marcus Johnson is that light. And his story reminds us that justice, while often delayed and imperfect, is still possible when people refuse to give up. Thank you for listening.